Hello, and welcome back to Historian at Midnight. There is a version of this story that most people already carry around with them, without ever having read a single ancient source. A cheerful, brightly coloured version, full of talking animals and triumphant music. A strong man with a good heart who wins every fight and marries the girl and lives, more or less, happily ever after. And we are going to spend tonight taking that comfortable version apart, gently but completely, because the man the Greeks actually told stories about for 1,000 years before anyone ever softened him. For a family audience was something far stranger and far sadder than a simple strong man, a man who spent his entire life paying, in the most literal and exhausting way imaginable, for a single unbearable act he committed in a fit of madness that was never, in any real sense, his own fault, and who found, at the very end of a life spent atoning for a crime the gods themselves had engineered, that even his atonement could not save him from one final, agonizing betrayal delivered, of all places, by the hands of the wife who loved him most. His name, to the Greeks who told his story first, was Hercules, a name that means, with a cruelty the story itself will make unbearably clear before tonight is over, the glory of Hera, the very goddess who spent his entire existence, from before his first breath to the very last afternoon of his mortal life, patiently and deliberately trying to destroy him. The Romans, borrowing him centuries later the way they borrowed so much else from the Greek world, called him Hercules, and it is that second, later, Romanized name that most of us actually grew up with, stripped by the long, slow process of retelling and softening across so many centuries of nearly everything that made the original older story worth telling in the first place. We are not going to rush toward the famous labours tonight, tempting as that is, because the labours themselves, 12 impossible tasks assigned to one exhausted man by a petty, frightened king, only make sense, only carry their true and terrible weight, once you understand exactly what they were a punishment for, and why a punishment was ever necessary at all for a man who did not, by any ordinary measure of guilt, choose to do what he did. This is a story about strength, certainly more raw physical strength than any other figure in the whole of Greek mythology was ever given, but it is really, underneath that strength, a story about the specific and terrible loneliness of being singled out before you're even born for a life of suffering that has nothing to do with anything you yourself have done, and about what it costs a person to spend an entire lifetime trying to earn back a piece that was stolen from him before he ever drew his first breath. We are going to take our time tonight, the way we always do in this room, letting each labour and each loss breathe before we move on to the next one, because a story built this heavily around grief deserves the patience of a slow, careful telling, rather than a hurried summary that rushes past everything that actually makes it matter. Let us say the thesis plainly, here at the very beginning, the way we like to on this channel, so you know the shape of the night ahead of you. This is a story about the difference between strength and self-mastery, and about how much more dangerous the first becomes when it exists without the second. It is the story of a man who could strangle serpents in his cradle and hold up the sky itself on his own two shoulders, and who nonetheless spent his entire adult life being undone again and again, not by any monster or any labour, but by his own unmanaged rage. A rage that a jealous goddess planted in him like a seed at the very moment of his birth, and that grew across his whole life into every single catastrophe that ever befell him and everyone he loved. It is worth carrying that thought with you through everything that follows tonight, because it is the one thread that ties this whole sprawling, episodic, monster-crowded story together into something with a genuine, aching shape. Before we drift into the rest of this story, take a quiet moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, leave your location and your local time down in the comments. It helps other restless, sleepless people find their way to this little corner of the night, and there is something pleasant about knowing that somewhere far away, a stranger is settling under the same dark sky, listening to the same slow story. So get comfortable, let your shoulders sink into the bed, settle in for a long and unhurried night, and let yourself ease into the long, strange, sorrowful tale of Hercules, the strongest man who ever lived, and by nearly every honest measure this story offers us, the unhappiest as well, a god disguised as a husband, and a queen of 2 wombs. To understand why a goddess would spend an entire mortal lifetime persecuting one single man with such focused, patient cruelty, we have to begin, as this whole story always begins, with an act of deception so audacious that it makes every other divine scandal we have discussed in this room look almost restrained by comparison. In the city of Thebes, in the years before this story properly opens, there lived a woman named Alcmene, celebrated across the whole Greek world, the old sources tell us, not merely for her beauty but for a wisdom and a dignity that made her, by every account, one of the most genuinely admirable mortal women in the entire mythic tradition, married to a nobleman named Amphitryon, a soldier and a prince in his own right, who had been exiled from his home city after an accidental killing and had settled with his new bride in Thebes, where he owed the local king a blood debt of vengeance against a marauding people called the Teleboans, who had killed Alcmene's own brothers. Amphitryon, honouring that debt, led an army off to war against the Teleboans, and it was during his absence, on the very night he was expected to return home victorious, that Zeus, king of the gods, looked down from Olympus and decided that Alcmene, faithful and grieving and waiting for her husband, was exactly the woman through whom he intended to father the single greatest hero the mortal world would ever know, a hero strong enough, Zeus is said to have already decided in advance, to one day defend both gods and mortals alike against threats that even Olympus itself could not face down unaided. Zeus did not approach her honestly, because honesty in these stories was almost never his method, and instead he took on the exact appearance and voice of Amphitryon himself, arriving at Alcmene's own door claiming to have returned early from his victorious campaign, and Alcmene, who had no reason on earth to doubt the face and voice of her own husband, welcomed him in. It is worth pausing on the sheer, almost comic audacity of what happened next, because the old sources tell it with a straight face that later ages have often found difficult to match. Zeus, wanting to prolong this single night as long as he possibly could, commanded the sun god not to rise the next morning, and the night, by every ancient account, stretched on for the length of 3 ordinary nights combined. A triple darkness that later poets would treat as one of the more memorable small miracles of the whole story, though it is worth noting too, how little that miracle actually benefited the woman experiencing it, since Alcmene herself had no idea anything unusual was even happening, believing she was simply spending an unexpectedly long and tender night with the husband she had been anxiously awaiting. The real Amphitryon returned home the very next day, triumphant from his own actual campaign against the Teleboans, and greeted his wife with all the joy of a man home from a hard-won war, only to find her strangely unmoved by news he had expected to be new to her, since she had, as far as she knew, already heard every detail of his victory the night before from his own lips. The confusion that followed, worked out eventually with the help of a blind seer named Tiresias, whom we have met before in this room in an entirely different story, revealed the truth to Amphitryon that his wife had unknowingly shared her bed with the king of the gods himself, and Amphitryon, to his considerable credit and the poem's own quiet approval, chose neither to abandon Alcmene nor to blame her for a deception she had no way of detecting, understanding that no mortal woman could reasonably be expected to see through the disguise of Zeus himself, and the two of them settled instead into an arrangement that the ancient world found strange but not, in the end, disgraceful, because Alcmene, in the month that followed, discovered she was carrying not one child, but 2, twins conceived on 2 separate nights, only hours apart, one fathered by Zeus and one fathered by her own true husband Amphitryon, a genuine and rather startling biological impossibility that the myth simply accepts, without further explanation, exactly the way it accepts every other impossible thing the gods choose to do. It is worth pausing here, before the story properly begins, on what this whole opening episode is quietly telling us, because it sets the shape of everything still to come. Heracles, the child conceived of Zeus, was going to be born into a family that already understood, from before his very first breath, that his existence was the product of a god's deception and a mortal woman's honest confusion. A child whose divine paternity would make him half a god and entitle him, eventually, to a place among the immortals, and whose mortal birth would also make him vulnerable, in every ordinary human way, to hunger and grief and exhaustion and death. A doubled nature that this whole story is going to spend its entire length exploring, because a man who is half god and half human, it turns out, inherits not the best of both conditions, but very often the hardest parts of each. A jealous queen and a cradle full of snakes, Hera, queen of the gods and Zeus's own long-suffering wife, had endured, by the time of this particular affair, centuries of her husband's infidelities with a patience that the old stories generally credit less to genuine forgiveness than to simple, weary practicality, since there was little a goddess, however powerful, could actually do to stop the king of all the gods from doing exactly as he pleased. But Alcmene's pregnancy touched a nerve that many of Zeus's other affairs had not, because Zeus himself, in a moment of boastful, careless pride that the whole rest of this story would come to regret bitterly, announced to the assembled gods on Olympus, on the very day Heracles was due to be born, that a child of his own bloodline born that day was destined to rule over all the surrounding lands, a proclamation Zeus meant, quite specifically, to apply to his unborn son by Alcmene. Hera, hearing this boast, saw in it not merely another humiliation to endure, but an actual concrete opportunity for revenge, and she acted with a speed and a cunning that the old sources describe with real, grudging admiration. She extracted from Zeus, before he understood what she was actually planning, a solemn and unbreakable oath, binding him to his own proclamation exactly as spoken, that whichever child of his own bloodline was born that very day would indeed inherit the promised rule, and then, the oath safely sworn and impossible for even Zeus himself to retract, she hurried down to Argos, where another descendant of Zeus's own line, a woman named Nisippe, was also pregnant, still some weeks from her own due date, and Hera, calling on the birth goddess Eileithyia to do her bidding, delayed Alcmene's labour by supernatural means while simultaneously hastening Nisippe's along, so that a boy named Eurystheus, weaker and lesser in every way the story cares to measure, was born first and, by the letter of Zeus's own careless, unbreakable oath, inherited the very kingship and destiny that had been meant for Heracles. It is worth pausing on this single act of divine trickery, because it is the hinge on which this entire story turns, and because it establishes, before Heracles has even drawn his first breath, exactly the shape of injustice this whole tale is going to keep returning to across every single one of its episodes. A destiny rightfully his, stolen from him by a goddess's clever manipulation of his own father's careless words, and a lesser man, Eurystheus, elevated by nothing more than the accident of a delayed and a hastened labour, into a position of authority over a hero who would spend, as we will discover, an entire decade of his own adult life, forced to serve that same lesser man's every command. Zeus, discovering too late what his wife had engineered, raged at the trick, but could not undo an oath even he himself was bound by, and could offer his own son in compensation only a single, distant consolation, that Heracles would indeed serve Eurystheus for a fixed span of labours, but that at the end of that service he would be granted a reward no ordinary mortal could ever hope for, a place among the immortal gods themselves. We will return to that promise, and to whether it was truly worth what it cost, at the very end of tonight's long story. Hera's revenge did not end with the mere theft of a kingship, because a goddess capable of that kind of patient, engineered cruelty was not the sort to be satisfied with a single humiliation, delivered once and then set aside. And when Heracles was still an infant of only a few months old, lying in his cradle beside his twin half-brother Iphicles, Amphitryon's own true son, Hera sent two enormous serpents slithering into the nursery in the dead of night, intending to end the threat this particular child represented before he ever grew old enough to become the hero Zeus had boasted of. Iphicles, the ordinary mortal child, woke screaming at the sight of the serpents and had to be rescued by his own terrified parents rushing in from another room. But Heracles, the old stories tell us with real relish, simply reached out with his own infant hands, one for each snake, and strangled both serpents to death in his cradle before his parents ever arrived. And Amphitryon and Alcmen, bursting into the nursery expecting to find tragedy, found instead their infant son sitting up amid the coils of two dead snakes, entirely unharmed and, by some accounts, actually delighted with his own toy-like discovery, laughing and holding the dead serpents up for his parents to admire. It is worth pausing on this single famous image, because it is doing real narrative work beyond simply establishing, in the most vivid way possible, exactly how extraordinary this particular child's strength already was, even in infancy. It is also the very first note in a pattern this whole story is going to repeat, with steadily rising and eventually unbearable cost, again and again across Heracles' entire life. Hera strikes, and Heracles survives, and each time he survives, the goddess's fury only deepens, because a threat that cannot be killed outright, in the logic of this kind of story, must eventually be broken by some other, crueler means. And it is worth remembering this cradle full of strangled serpents when we come, later tonight, to a cradle of an entirely different and far more terrible kind that Hera will one day arrange for this same man to fill with his own hands, a boy raised for greatness, and a music teacher who paid for one harsh word. Heracles grew, in the years that followed his infant triumph over the serpents, into exactly the kind of prodigy his miraculous birth had promised, trained by the finest teachers Thebes and the wider Greek world could offer, instructed in archery by a renowned marksman named Eurytus, in wrestling and the arts of combat by other celebrated masters, and, in a detail the old stories linger on because of how badly it eventually goes, in music and the playing of the lyre by a teacher named Linus, who was, in some versions of this tradition, a brother of the great mythical musician Orpheus himself, and a figure of real and celebrated skill in his own right. The lessons with Linus did not go well, and it is worth telling the story of exactly why, because it offers us our first clear, uncomfortable glimpse of a temperament that was going to define the rest of this entire tale. Linus, frustrated one day by his young pupil's clumsiness at the instrument, or by some slight disrespect the boy had shown him, depending on which ancient telling you follow, struck Heracles, in a moment of ordinary exasperated teacherly anger of exactly the kind any strict instructor of that era might show an unruly student. And Heracles, still only a boy but already possessed of a strength no ordinary child could match, and a temper that no one, it seems, had yet taught him how to properly govern, struck back with the lyre itself, a single blow delivered in blind, unthinking fury rather than any deliberate intent to kill, and the blow landed with such catastrophic and unintended force that it killed his own music teacher on the spot. It is worth pausing on this episode, brief and shocking as it is, because it is the first appearance, in this hero's own childhood, of exactly the pattern that will eventually destroy nearly everything he loves. A moment of provocation, entirely ordinary and entirely survivable for anyone with normal human strength, met with a physical response so disproportionate, so entirely unmoderated by any internal restraint, that it ends in a death no one, least of all Heracles himself, actually intended. Heracles was tried for the killing before the courts of Thebes, and acquitted, the old sources tell us, on the grounds that he had acted in justified self-defence against a teacher's unwarranted blow rather than in cold or premeditated violence. A verdict that let the boy walk free but that ought, looking back on it now with the whole rest of this story in mind, to have worried everyone around him considerably more than it apparently did. Amphitryon, alarmed nonetheless by what his foster son's uncontrolled strength had already cost one innocent man's life, sent Heracles away from the city entirely to be raised instead among the herdsmen and cattle of the surrounding countryside, hoping that hard, honest, physically demanding rural labour might do what formal instruction so evidently could not, and teach the boy some measure of the discipline his own body's tremendous power so urgently required. It was in that same countryside exile, while Heracles was still only a young man of about 18 years, that he faced and killed the Lion of Kithaeron, a genuinely dangerous predator that had been terrorising the herds of both Amphitryon's own household and the neighbouring kingdom of Thespia, and it's worth pausing on this early, relatively modest monster slaying, because it is the very first sign, in the story's own chronology, of the destiny that had been promised for this particular child. A young man not yet fully grown, already capable of tracking down and killing, with nothing but his own hands and a club cut from a wild olive tree, a beast that had defeated every other hunter sent against it. It was during this same hunting expedition, staying as a guest at the court of King Thespius of Thespiae for 50 consecutive nights, while he tracked the lion through the surrounding hills, that Heracles became, in one of the stranger and more uncomfortable episodes the old sources report with remarkably little embarrassment, the father of 50 separate sons, because Thespius, wanting descendants of this extraordinary young hero's own remarkable bloodline for his own family line, is said to have sent one of his 50 daughters to Heracles' bed on each of those 50 nights, and Heracles, according to some versions, genuinely unaware that he was sleeping with a different woman each night rather than the same one, fathered 50 children in the space of less than 2 months, a detail this channel mentions not to dwell on but simply to note, because it tells us something true about how differently this whole ancient tradition understood a hero's physical vitality from the way any modern audience would be inclined to frame the same events. A war won, a princess earned, and a madness that came without warning. Heracles' return to Thebes, once the Lion of Kithaeron had been dealt with, brought him almost immediately into a war that would win him both real glory and, in the fullness of time, a wife, because Thebes at that moment stood under humiliating tribute to a neighbouring kingdom called Orchomenus, forced by an old and unresolved grievance to pay an annual tax of 100 cattle to a king named Erginus, a burden the city had endured for years without any real hope of ending it by force. Heracles, newly returned and already carrying the reputation his lion-slaying had earned him, led the Theban army against Erginus's forces and won a decisive, tribute-ending victory, a triumph so complete and so welcome to the city that had raised him, that the grateful King Creon of Thebes, in reward, gave Heracles the hand of his own daughter, a young princess named Megara, in marriage. The marriage that followed, by every account the old sources give us, was a genuinely happy one, and it is worth pausing on this brief, quiet interlude of real domestic contentment, because the story is about to make sure we understand exactly how much it is worth, by taking it away with a suddenness and a cruelty that even this whole grim tradition rarely matches elsewhere. Heracles and Megara had, across the several years the old sources allow this marriage to last, either 3 or 8 children together, depending on which ancient telling you follow, a household the poets describe with real warmth, a strong, celebrated hero settled at last into the ordinary, treasured business of fatherhood and married life that his own tumultuous childhood had never really given him the chance to know. It was into this single, genuine patch of happiness, and precisely because it was a genuine patch of happiness, that Hera, who had never once relented in her decades-long campaign against this one particular son of her husband's infidelity, finally delivered the single cruelest blow of this entire story, a blow so devastating that everything Heracles does for the rest of his life, every monster faced and every labour completed, has to be understood as, in some sense, an attempt to answer for it, even though, as we're about to see in the most unambiguous terms this tradition ever offers, it was never, in any meaningful sense, his own fault at all. Hera sent down upon Heracles a fit of madness so total and so violently disorienting that he lost, for its entire duration, any ability to recognise even his own family, seeing before him, in his own home, not his wife and his own beloved children, but enemies, monsters, threats that his own battle-trained instincts told him had to be destroyed immediately and without hesitation. And in that state, with no more awareness of what he was actually doing than a sleepwalker has of his own actions, Heracles killed his own children, and in most tellings of this unbearable episode, came close to killing Megara herself as well, before the madness at last released its grip on him, leaving him standing amid a wreckage that no explanation, divine or otherwise, could ever make survivable to look at honestly. It is worth pausing on this scene for a long moment, because it is the single most important event in this entire story. The dark, unbearable centre around which everything else, every labour, every later triumph, every eventual apotheosis is built, and it deserves to be treated with exactly the weight the ancient tradition itself gave it, rather than rushed past toward the more comfortable adventures still ahead of us tonight. The great Athenian playwright Euripides, staging this exact scene for a live audience in the 5th century before Christ, in a tragedy simply called Hercules, gives us the fullest and most unflinching version of exactly how this madness actually descended, describing a goddess named Lyssa, the very embodiment of frenzy and rage itself, sent down at Hera's own direct command specifically to seize Heracles' mind, and Lyssa herself, remarkably, is given a voice in that same play to express her own reluctance at the task, protesting that Heracles has done nothing to deserve this particular punishment, and that she takes no pleasure in becoming the instrument of a cruelty this total, a small and rather startling detail that even the personified spirit of madness itself, within the story's own logic, recognised how unjust this particular assignment actually was, before duty to an angrier and more powerful goddess overrode her own evident sympathy. Once the madness took hold, Euripides shows us Heracles believing, in his own frenzied mind, that he was travelling to a distant city to kill the very man, Eurystheus, whose commands had already shaped so much of his life, and mistaking his own children, cowering in their own home, for that same enemy's sons, cutting them down one after another with the same bow that had already killed the Stymphalian birds and would go on, in different hands and years later, to help finish the war at Troy, while Megara herself, in this same version of the story, was spared only because Athena intervened directly, striking Heracles down with a stone flung hard enough to knock him unconscious before he could complete the same violence against his own wife that he had already visited on their children. It is worth pausing, too, on what happened to Megara herself in the long aftermath of this catastrophe, because her own fate is one of the quieter tragedies this story tends to let slip past unremarked. Several ancient sources tell us that Heracles, once his own sanity returned and the full weight of what his own hands had done settled over him, could no longer bear to remain married to the woman who now stood, for him, as a living, breathing witness to the very worst thing he had ever done, and gave her, in a resolution this tradition presents without much comment on how Megara herself might have felt about it, to his own loyal nephew Iolaus in marriage instead, a woman who had lost her own children to her husband's madness, now quietly reassigned to a new household, as though grief of this size could simply be administratively resolved. One more small silence in a story that, as we noted at real length in another night's telling of a different hero's own voyage, does not always trouble itself to give its women the same interior life it so freely grants its men. And it is worth naming, finally, the friend who kept Heracles alive long enough to seek out the very oracle that would set him on the path of the labours at all, because Euripides gives that role, in his own version of this story, to Theseus, the young Athenian hero whose own path would cross Heracles' again, years later, in the rescue from the underworld we have already described tonight. Finding Heracles in the wreckage of his own home, his face covered in shame and his mind already turning, by his own admission, toward taking his own life rather than living another day with what he had done, Theseus refused to leave him, arguing that no man should be held guilty for a crime the gods themselves engineered, and physically drew him back from the edge of that despair, leading him instead toward Athens and toward the purification that would eventually set him on the road to Delphi. And it is worth holding that single act of friendship alongside everything else in tonight's story, because it means that Heracles' entire subsequent life, every labour and every later triumph, exists at all only because one loyal friend refused to let him die in the ruins of his own worst hour. When the madness finally lifted and Heracles came back to himself, standing in his own home surrounded by the bodies of the children he had raised and loved, understanding all at once, with a clarity that must have been almost impossible to bear, exactly what his own hands had done while some force outside his own control had been driving them. His grief and his horror, the old sources tell us, were total and genuine. A man confronting the single worst thing any human being can be made to confront, and finding unbearably that he himself had been the instrument of it. It is worth noticing, too, exactly where the story places the blame for this catastrophe, because it is unusually clear and unusually insistent about it, in a tradition that often leaves moral responsibility far murkier than this. This was not a crime born of Heracles' own uncontrolled temper, the way the killing of his music teacher Linus had been, a moment of ordinary human anger escalating past its proper bounds. This was a divine act, engineered deliberately and with real premeditated malice, by a goddess who had spent Heracles' entire life waiting for exactly the right moment to strike at him through the people he loved most. And the story insists, again and again across every later retelling, that Heracles bears no true moral guilt for what happened in that house, that the hands were his own but the will directing them belonged, in every meaningful sense, to Hera alone. And yet, and this is the almost unbearable paradox that this whole story asks us to sit with, the grief was entirely his own to carry regardless, because a man's own hands, however possessed or however innocent his intentions, do not stop having done what they did simply because some outside force compelled them, and Heracles would spend, as we are about to discover, the rest of his entire life trying to answer for a crime that every honest accounting agrees was never truly his to answer for at all. An oracle's sentence, and a decade of service to a lesser man. Heracles, in the aftermath of this catastrophe, did what any person of real conscience in his position would do, seeking out purification for the killing of kin, a specific and serious category of pollution in ancient Greek religious thought that required formal ritual cleansing before a person so stained could be readmitted to ordinary religious and social life. And he travelled in search of guidance about how such an unbearable debt might ever be properly paid to the oracle of Apollo at Delphi, the same sacred site whose priestess we have discussed in other stories told in this room, seeking some path forward out of a grief that threatened, by his own admission in several ancient tellings, to end in his own suicide. The oracle's answer, delivered through the Pythia in the riddling, indirect manner these prophecies always favoured, instructed Heracles to travel to the city of Tiryns and place himself in the service of King Eurystheus, that same lesser cousin whose kingship Hera had stolen for him at the very moment of Heracles' own birth, and to perform, without complaint or refusal, whatever tasks that king should choose to set him for a period of 10 years, or, in some versions, 12. And it was the oracle, in this same pronouncement, who first gave Heracles the name by which the whole rest of history would come to know him, because he had been called, up until this point in his life, by an earlier name Alces. after his mortal grandfather Alcaeus, and it was the Pythia's own prophecy that renamed him Heracles, the glory of Hera, a name whose bitter irony the whole ancient audience would have felt immediately, since the very goddess whose name he was now compelled to carry forever was the same goddess who had engineered every catastrophe of his entire life up to that point. And it is worth pausing on that irony, because it means that Heracles was going to spend the rest of his existence, and the whole of recorded human history since, carrying his own tormentor's name stitched permanently into his own identity, a walking, breathing monument to the very goddess who hated him. It is worth pausing, too, on the genuine strangeness of the arrangement the oracle laid out, because it asked Heracles to accept something that must have felt, to any ordinary sense of justice, like an additional and undeserved humiliation piled on top of an already unbearable grief, submission for a full decade of his own adult life, to the authority of a man who held his position only because Hera's trickery had stolen it from Heracles himself, before either of them had even been born, a king the old sources describe, with real and pointed contempt, as timid, petty, and thoroughly unworthy of commanding a hero of Heracles' own stature, a man who would spend much of the following decade, as we are about to see, cowering in actual physical terror of the very monsters he was sending his unwilling servant to face. And yet Heracles accepted the arrangement without complaint, because the alternative, an unpurified, unatoned crime hanging over him for the rest of his life, was worse than any humiliation Eurystheus could devise, and it is worth carrying that acceptance with us into every single one of the 12 labours still ahead of us tonight, because each one of them, however fantastical the monster, or however clever the trick required to defeat it, is really, underneath its own particular adventure, one more instalment in a debt Heracles never actually owed but chose, out of a grief too large for any lesser response, to pay in full regardless. A lion that no blade could pierce. The first task Eurystheus set for his unwilling servant was, in its own way, a fitting opening to the whole grim decade ahead, because it asked Heracles to travel to the valley of Nemea, not far from Eurystheus' own court, and kill a lion that had been terrorizing the countryside for years, a beast that was, the old stories make clear from the very beginning, no ordinary predator, said by some tellings to be the offspring of monstrous parents from the earliest, most chaotic generation of divine beings, and possessed, in every single version of this story, of a hide so impossibly tough that no arrow, no spear, and no sword forged by any mortal smith could so much as break its skin. Heracles discovered this fact the hard way, and it is worth pausing on how the story handles his discovery of it, because it establishes, right at the very start of this whole cycle of labours, the pattern of resourceful, patient problem-solving that is going to define Heracles' approach to nearly every monster still ahead of him tonight. He first tried his bow, loosing arrow after arrow at the great lion, only to watch each one bounce harmlessly off its impenetrable hide, as though he were shooting at solid stone. And it was only after that first, humbling failure that Heracles understood he would need an entirely different strategy, one that relied not on weapons at all, but on his own overwhelming physical strength applied directly, hand to claw, with nothing between them. He tracked the lion to its lair, a cave with 2 separate entrances, and showing a tactical patience that this whole tradition does not always credit him with, blocked up one of the 2 entrances with heavy stone before entering through the other, driving the cornered beast into a confrontation it could not escape by fleeing into some other tunnel. And there, in the darkness of that sealed cave, Heracles wrestled the lion with his own bare hands, wrapping his arm around its throat and choking the life out of it, in a contest of pure strength that the old sources describe as having cost Heracles one of his own fingers, bitten off in the animal's own final desperate throes, though even that injury did nothing to loosen his grip until the beast finally went still. Having killed the lion, Heracles faced one more small problem that turned out, in its own modest way, to be nearly as instructive as the killing itself. He wanted to keep the animal's magnificent arrow-proof hide as a trophy, and more practically as armour for himself. But no knife or blade he possessed could cut through skin that no weapon could pierce in the first place, and it was only when the goddess Athena, who appears throughout this whole cycle of labours as a quiet, steady ally to Heracles in a way that stands in deliberate contrast to Hera's relentless persecution, suggested that he use one of the lion's own claws to skin it, that Heracles finally solved the puzzle, cutting the impenetrable hide with the only thing on earth sharp enough to manage it. He wore that lion's skin, from this labour forward, as his own personal armour and his own instantly recognisable emblem, the great tawny pelt draped over his shoulders and the lion's own head worn like a helmet over his own, an image that would become, across the following centuries of Greek and Roman art, the single most identifiable visual signature this hero ever possessed, appearing on vases and coins and statues for 1,000 years afterward, so that a viewer needed no label at all to know, at a single glance, exactly whose story a particular image was telling. Eurystheus, receiving news that his unwilling servant had returned from Nemea not merely victorious, but wearing the supposedly invulnerable lion's own skin as a trophy, was reportedly so terrified by the sheer scale of the strength this first labour had already demonstrated that he refused from that point forward to let Heracles enter the city itself at all, having a great bronze storage jar buried in the ground outside the palace gates for himself to hide inside whenever his servant returned from a new labour, and ordering that all future instructions be relayed to Heracles second-hand through a herald rather than delivered face-to-face, a detail this whole tradition treats with real, pointed comedy, because it means that the entire remaining decade of these labours was conducted by a king too frightened to even look directly at the man he had been given divine license to command, a monster with heads that would not stay dead. The second labour took Heracles to the swamps near the city of Lerna, where a monstrous serpent called the Hydra, another child of the same monstrous lineage as the Nemean lion, lived in the marshland and terrorised the surrounding countryside with a poison so virulent that its very breath, in some tellings, could kill a man who came too close, and whose body bore multiple heads, the exact number varying wildly across different ancient sources, from as few as 5 to as many as 100, one of which, every version agrees, was entirely immortal and could never be destroyed by any means at all. Heracles did not face this labour alone, and it is worth pausing on that detail because it marks one of the very few times in this entire cycle that he accepts real, sustained help from another mortal, bringing along his own nephew, a young man named Iolaus, the son of his twin half-brother Iphicles, to serve as his charioteer and assistant. The battle itself revealed, almost immediately, the true horror of what made this particular monster so much more dangerous than the Nemean lion had been. Every time Heracles struck off one of the Hydra's heads with his sword, 2 new heads grew back in its place from the same bleeding stump, so that a straightforward contest of pure strength, the very approach that had served him so well against the lion, was here making his own situation actively worse with every single blow he landed, the monster growing more heads, not fewer, the longer the fight continued. It was Iolaus who solved the problem, at Heracles' own urging, by taking up a burning brand from a nearby fire and searing each fresh stump immediately after Heracles severed a head, cauterizing the wound before it had any chance to sprout a new pair of heads in its place. And it was through this combination of raw strength and quick cooperative improvisation that the 2 of them finally worked their way through every one of the Hydra's mortal heads, leaving only the single immortal head remaining, which Heracles finally severed and buried, still living and still hissing, deep beneath a massive boulder where it could trouble the world no further, since a head that could not be killed still had to be dealt with somehow, even if outright destruction was never going to be possible. It is worth pausing on one further detail from this same labour, because it would matter enormously decades later in a scene we are going to reach near the very end of tonight's story. Before sealing away the monster's remains, Heracles dipped the tips of his own arrows in the Hydra's poisonous blood, creating from that single act a supply of weapons so lethal that even the smallest wound from one of them would prove fatal to anything mortal, or even, as later episodes will demonstrate, to beings far greater than mortal. And it is worth holding on to that detail now, because a weapon this powerful, created almost as an afterthought at the end of one labour, is going to return much later tonight, in a form that Heracles himself could never have anticipated. Eurystheus, on learning that Heracles had needed his own nephew's assistance to complete this second labour, declared, with the same petty, hair-splitting cowardice that would characterise his relationship with Heracles across this entire decade, that the labour did not properly count, since Heracles had not defeated the monster entirely by his own unaided effort, and it is worth noting this small, spiteful ruling now because it establishes a pattern of the king simply refusing, whenever it suited him, to credit labours that had genuinely been completed. A pattern that would eventually swell the supposedly fixed number of tasks considerably beyond whatever original count the oracle had actually specified. It is worth pausing on that arithmetic plainly, here at the start of this whole long cycle, so the shape of the injustice is clear before we walk through the rest of it together. The oracle at Delphi had originally sentenced Heracles to 10 labours, not 12, and it was only these 2 separate acts of royal pettiness. This disqualified Hydra, and several labours from now, an equally disqualified set of stables, that stretched the sentence out by 2 additional tasks beyond what had actually been required of him, meaning that Heracles served, in the end, 2 full labours of extra, entirely unearned penance simply because the one man empowered to judge his work could never bring himself to call a debt paid in full. It is worth pausing too on the 2 mortal men standing quietly at the edges of this whole story, because it is easy, amid so much godly meddling and monstrous adventure, to lose sight of the ordinary human family Heracles actually grew up inside. Amphitryon, the mortal stepfather who raised him alongside his own true-born son without ever once, so far as the old sources tell it, treating the boy differently for being another man's child by blood, does not survive to see any of the 12 labours himself, dying instead in battle during a war fought defending Thebes years before the madness and the labours that followed it. A death that meant the one steady, entirely human presence in young Heracles' early life. A man who forgave his own wife a betrayal that was never her fault, and raised a demigod as tenderly as he raised his own son, was gone long before his foster son's own troubles truly began. And Iphicles, the twin-born of that same double-fathered pregnancy, but carrying none of Zeus's own blood, lived his whole life a half-step behind a brother whose strength he could never match, and whose fame he could never approach, and yet the old sources give him no bitterness at all for it, showing him instead as a loyal and devoted brother who fought alongside Heracles in several of his later campaigns, and who was himself wounded badly enough in one of those same battles that he died of it not long after. One more quiet loss folded into a life that had already, by that point, absorbed so many. A hind too swift to catch, and a year spent simply running. The 3rd labour asks something of Heracles that neither the lion nor the hydra had required at all. Patience rather than raw force, because Eurystheus, growing wary after 2 labours that had each ended in a dead monster, and a triumphant Heracles, set his servant the task of capturing, alive, and entirely unharmed, a sacred deer called the Ceryneian hind, an animal so swift that no hunter had ever managed to catch it, sacred to the goddess Artemis herself, and adorned, in every telling of this story, with golden antlers and hooves of bronze, a creature whose capture demanded that Heracles bring it back not as a corpse, but as a living, breathing trophy, which meant that his usual method of simply overpowering an opponent through direct physical force was, for the very first time in this whole cycle, entirely unavailable to him. Heracles pursued that single hind, the old sources tell us, for an entire year, tracking it across mountain and plain and river without ever quite closing the distance enough to catch it outright. A chase that took him, by some accounts, as far north as the legendary land of the Hyperboreans at the very edge of the known world, and it was only after this whole extraordinarily long pursuit, when the exhausted animal finally paused to drink at a river, that Heracles managed either to catch it in a carefully cast net or, in an alternate and more merciful version of the tale, to wound it with a single arrow through the space between its tendon and its bone, precise enough to slow the animal without drawing blood or causing any lasting injury, allowing him to sling it, still living, across his own shoulders and begin the long walk back to Eurystheus' court. It was on that return journey that Heracles encountered Artemis herself, furious to find one of her own sacred animals being carried off, and it is worth pausing on how Heracles handled this confrontation, because it shows us a side of his character this whole tradition does not always emphasize as clearly as it emphasizes his brute strength. Rather than fighting a goddess he had no wish to offend, he explained honestly that he was acting under compulsion, bound by the oracle's own sentence to serve Eurystheus' commands, and asked her forgiveness, promising to return the hind unharmed once Eurystheus had seen it, and Artemis, satisfied by his honesty and his evident respect, allowed him to continue on his way. A small, quiet episode of diplomacy, succeeding where force could never have worked at all, and worth remembering later tonight when we come to labours where Heracles' temper gets the better of exactly this kind of restraint. A boar, a cave full of wine, and the accidental death of a wise old friend. The fourth labour sent Heracles after another dangerous animal, a monstrous boar that had been ravaging the region around Mount Erymanthus, and Eurystheus, once again demanding the creature be brought back alive rather than simply killed, set Heracles on a hunt that would prove far more consequential for what happened along the way than for the boar itself. Because it was on this same journey that Heracles paid a visit to a wise and gentle centaur named Pholus, an old friend among a race of creatures, half man and half horse, that the wider Greek tradition generally portrayed as violent, lawless, and prone to uncontrollable drunkenness, but that this particular centaur represented in an entirely different and far more civilized light. Pholus welcomed Heracles warmly and served him a meal of roasted meat, though he himself, following the customs of his own more disciplined household, ate his food raw, and when Heracles asked for wine to go with the meal, Pholus hesitated, explaining that the jar of wine in his cave was not his own personal property to share, but belonged communally to all the centaurs of the surrounding mountains, a shared and sacred resource that etiquette forbade him from opening for a single guest alone. Heracles, never a man inclined to let a technicality of hospitality stand between himself and a good meal, persuaded his host to open the jar anyway, and the powerful aroma of unmixed wine, extraordinarily potent by the standards of the diluted wine ordinary Greeks typically drank, carried out across the mountainside and drew every other centaur in the region down to Pholus's cave in a state of immediate furious outrage at what they took to be a theft of their shared property. What followed was a chaotic, drunken brawl between Heracles and a whole crowd of enraged, wine-maddened centaurs, and Heracles, fighting for his own life against overwhelming numbers, drew on the very poisoned arrows he had prepared back at the swamp of Lerna, striking down centaur after centaur, with wounds that killed swiftly and irreversibly, given the Hydra's venom coursing through them. It was in the course of this same chaotic fight that one of those poisoned arrows, fired in the heat of a desperate melee, struck a centaur who had no part whatsoever in the original quarrel, an old, wise, and genuinely revered figure named Chiron, tutor across the generations to many of Greek mythology's greatest heroes, and, unlike nearly every other centaur in this same story, immortal by his own divine birth rather than by any special favour. It is worth pausing on this single accidental wound, because it produced one of the most quietly tragic outcomes in this entire story. A wound from the same poison that had already killed so many, striking a being who could not, by the terms of his own divine nature, actually die from it at all, condemning Chiron instead to an agony that had no natural end in sight, a suffering so total and so permanent that Chiron himself, in the end, begged the gods to be allowed to give up his own immortality entirely and die, a wish eventually granted in most tellings, when the immortality Chiron surrendered was transferred instead to the suffering chained titan Prometheus, whom we will meet again later tonight in a story of his own. And Pholus himself, Heracles' original innocent host in all of this, died in the same episode through nothing more than his own simple curiosity, examining one of the poisoned arrows that had killed one of his own kinsmen and accidentally dropping it on his own foot, dying almost instantly from a wound he had inflicted entirely on himself. It is worth sitting with this whole episode for a moment, because it is one of the clearest and most uncomfortable illustrations, so early in this cycle of labours, of exactly the pattern we spoke of at the very start of tonight's story. Heracles' own overwhelming power, deployed here in what began as an entirely reasonable act of self-defence against a genuinely threatening mob, spills over, almost immediately, into consequences far beyond anything the moment actually demanded, killing a wise and gentle friend who had done nothing but offer hospitality, and condemning an immortal teacher to an agony so total that he eventually had to trade away his own immortality simply to escape it. Heracles did, in the end, complete the labour itself in a far gentler and more straightforward fashion, driving the Erymanthian boar into a deep snowbank, where its own struggling exhausted it enough for him to bind it in chains and carry it, alive and thoroughly cowed, back to Eurystheus' court, where the terrified king, seeing the enormous living boar actually being carried into his own palace, is said to have leapt into his buried storage jar so quickly and so completely that only his head remained visible above the rim. But the labour's true cost, this whole tradition insists on making clear, had already been paid several mountains away in the deaths of a wise host and a gentle teacher who had never done Heracles any wrong at all. A king's filth, and a river bent to a new course. The fifth labour is, by a wide margin, the least glamorous task in this entire cycle, and it is worth pausing on that fact, because it tells us something honest about how this whole tradition understood the true, unglamorous nature of hard labour, even when it was inventing tasks for the greatest hero the Greek world had ever imagined, Eurystheus, perhaps hoping to humiliate his unwilling servant with a task that offered no monster to fight and no glory to win, ordered Heracles to clean, in a single day, the enormous stables of King Augeas of Elis, a man whose vast herds of cattle, numbering by some accounts in the many thousands, had gone entirely uncleaned for years, or in some tellings decades, producing an accumulation of filth so total that the surrounding land itself had begun to suffer for it. Fields rendered useless, and the very air made foul by a mess that no ordinary team of labourers could have cleared in less than a great many months of continuous work. Heracles, arriving at Augeas' court, did something that reveals, once again, a cleverness this tradition credits him with far more consistently than popular memory usually allows, striking a private bargain with the king before he ever lifted a single shovel. He would clean the entire stables in a single day, an achievement Augeas considered so plainly impossible that he agreed, without any real risk to himself as he believed, to pay Heracles 1/10 of his own vast cattle herd, as a reward should the task actually be accomplished. Heracles then solved the problem not through brute labour at all, but through simple, elegant engineering, diverting the courses of two nearby rivers, the Alpheus and the Peneus, and channeling their combined flow directly through the stables themselves, letting the sheer force of running water accomplish in a matter of hours what no team of men could have managed even with years of steady digging. It is worth pausing on this labour, brief and unglamorous as it is compared to the monster slaying that surrounds it on both sides, because it shows us a Heracles solving a problem through intelligence and resourcefulness rather than through raw strength alone. Exactly the kind of quiet cleverness this whole story keeps demonstrating in him, even as its popular, simplified retellings tend to remember only the muscle. But the labour's aftermath turned sour in a way that reveals something less flattering about the wider human world Heracles was serving, because Augeas, once the stables stood spotless, refused to honour his own bargain, arguing that Heracles had only accomplished the task at Eurystheus' own royal command in the first place, and therefore deserved no separate personal payment for work he was already obligated to perform, a piece of bad faith that Eurystheus himself, for entirely different and characteristically petty reasons, seized upon to declare that this labour too did not properly count toward the total, since Heracles had attempted to profit personally from a task assigned to him as unpaid service, so that a labour completed with real, admirable cleverness ended up counting for nothing at all in the official tally, cheated on twice over by two separate kings in the very same episode. Birds with feathers of bronze, and a lesson in noise over force. The sixth labour took Heracles to Lake Stymphalis, where a great flock of monstrous birds had taken up residence, creatures the old sources describe as having feathers sharp and hard enough to be loosed like arrows, and a diet that included human flesh. A flock so numerous and so dangerous that they had driven the entire surrounding countryside into abandonment, and it is worth pausing on this labour because it required Heracles, for the first time in this whole cycle, to solve a problem that neither strength nor patience alone could crack, since the birds nested deep within a marsh too thick with mud and reeds for any man to wade through safely, and simply firing arrows blindly into that impenetrable cover promised, at best, to kill only a handful of a flock that numbered in the thousands. It was the goddess Athena, once again appearing as Heracles' quiet, steady ally, in exactly the way she had guided him towards skinning the Nemean lion, who provided the actual solution this time, giving him a pair of bronze castanets, or in some tellings a great bronze rattle, forged by the god Hephaestus himself, instruments that produced, when struck together, a noise so sudden and so unbearably loud that the birds, panicked into flight by a sound unlike anything they had ever encountered, rose up out of the marsh in one great, startled cloud, and it was only once they were airborne and exposed rather than hidden and protected within the reeds that Heracles was able to bring down as many of them as he could reach with his own bow, driving the rest to flee the region entirely and never return. It is worth pausing briefly on how neatly this labour mirrors the very first one, the Nemean lion, whose invulnerable hide made ordinary weapons useless until cleverness rather than force found the answer. Because this whole cycle keeps returning again and again to the same essential lesson, that Heracles' extraordinary strength, however necessary it remains for the final killing blow in nearly every one of these labours, is never actually sufficient on its own. That some other quality, patience, cunning, or in this case simply the willingness to accept a clever tool offered by a wiser ally, has to come first before that strength can be properly applied at all. A lesson that stands in constant quiet tension with the story of his own children's deaths. A tragedy caused by exactly the kind of overwhelming physical force that had no cleverness or restraint attached to it whatsoever. It is worth pausing, briefly, on the real geography sitting underneath this particular labour, because Lake Stymphalis is not a poet's invention, but an actual, still visible body of water in the mountains of Arcadia in the central Peloponnese, a lake that has a curious habit, well documented by later ancient travellers and still true of the site today, of shrinking to little more than a marsh in dry summers and swelling again with the autumn rains, a seasonal, half-vanishing wetland that would have made exactly the kind of thick, impenetrable reed cover. This myth describes an entirely plausible home for a large flock of any genuinely dangerous bird. One more small example of this whole tradition rooting its most fantastical monsters in a landscape any ancient listener could have walked to and recognised for themselves, a bull too wild for any pen, and an island that would remember it forever. The seventh labour sent Heracles across the sea entirely, to the island of Crete, where King Minos, whom we have discussed at length in another story told in this room concerning his own son's labyrinth and a hero named Theseus, kept a magnificent bull that the sea god Poseidon himself had once sent up from the depths of the ocean as a sign of favour, expecting Minos to sacrifice the beautiful creature back to him in thanks, and it was Minos' own decision to keep the bull for himself rather than complete the sacrifice, sacrificing a lesser animal in its place that had set in motion, in that separate story, an entire chain of divine punishment involving Minos' own wife and the birth of the Minotaur, a whole tragedy this poem's own audience would have known well and recognised instantly the moment this same bull reappeared in Hercules' own labour. By the time Heracles arrived to claim it, the bull, whether through the same divine curse that had already caused so much grief in Minos' own household, or simply through its own untamed nature, had grown savage and destructive, ravaging the countryside of Crete much as the Erymanthian boar had ravaged the mountains of the Peloponnese, and Minos, eager to be rid of the troublesome creature, and glad enough to let this famous foreign hero take the risk of confronting it, gave Heracles his full blessing to capture it and take it away. Heracles wrestled the bull into submission with his own bare hands, exactly as he had once wrestled the Nemean lion, and sailed it back across the open sea to the Greek mainland, an image the old sources clearly relish, an enormous, furious bull ridden or towed across the water by a single man's own overwhelming strength, and delivered it to Eurystheus, who, following his by now familiar pattern of wanting nothing to do with any creature dangerous enough to have actually challenged his servant, ordered it released rather than kept. It is worth pausing on where that released bull eventually wandered, because it connects this labour to a story we may well tell in full on another night in this room. Freed from captivity, the Cretan bull made its way to the region around Marathon, where it continued terrorising the countryside for years afterward under the name the Marathonian Bull, until it was finally captured and killed in an entirely separate adventure decades later by the young Athenian hero Theseus himself, whose own story is filled with echoes and rivalries with Heracles that the wider tradition delighted in drawing out, two of the greatest heroes of the Greek world connected, however loosely, by the same single bull passing from one story into the other, mares that ate human flesh, and a king fed to his own horses. The eighth labour brought Heracles to Thrace, to the court of a king named Diomedes, not to be confused with the Greek hero of the same name, who fought at Troy in a story we discussed at length on another night in this room, a different Diomedes entirely, a son of the war god Ares, who kept a stable of 4 magnificent mares with a singular and horrifying feeding habit. Rather than ordinary grain or grass, these mares had been trained by their own master to eat human flesh, fed a steady diet of any unfortunate travellers or guests who happened to pass through Diomedes' own kingdom. A horror the old sources describe with a bluntness that makes this particular king one of the more genuinely monstrous human figures in this whole cycle of labours, since every other threat Heracles has faced so far has been an animal, or a beast acting according to its own nature, while this cruelty belonged entirely to a man who had chosen it deliberately. Heracles' task was simply to capture these man-eating mares and bring them back to Eurystheus, and the confrontation that followed, in most tellings of the story, ended with a justice that this whole tradition clearly savours. Heracles overpowered Diomedes' own guards, and in some versions with the help of a young companion named Abderus who accompanied him on this expedition, seized control of the mares themselves, and when Diomedes came in pursuit with an armed force to reclaim his prized and terrible horses, Heracles killed him and fed his own body to the very mares he had spent years feeding on other men's flesh. A poetic justice so neat that it borders on the theatrical, and one that had the immediate practical effect of calming the animals considerably, since human flesh fed to them by their own dead master's hands seems, in the story's own peculiar logic, to have broken whatever taste for it they had previously acquired, allowing Heracles to lead them away peacefully after that single grim meal. It is worth pausing briefly on the fate of young Abderus in this same episode, because most tellings of the story do not let this labour end entirely in triumph. Left in charge of the mares for a moment while Heracles dealt with Diomedes' pursuing soldiers, Abderus was overpowered by the horses and killed, dragged to death or devoured before Heracles could return to protect him, and Heracles, grieving this loss exactly as he grieved the deaths of Pholus and Chiron in the previous cycle of labours, founded a city on the spot in the young man's honour, naming it Abdera after him, a real and historically attested city on the Thracian coast that stood for centuries afterward. One more small, sad reminder that even the labours framed as triumphant victories in this whole story rarely arrive without some genuine cost attached, some companion or ally lost along the way as the price of Heracles' own continued survival. A belt freely offered, and a goddess's lie that ended in tragedy. The ninth labour asked Heracles to retrieve the war belt of Hippolyta, queen of the Amazons, a legendary nation of warrior women who lived, in the geography of this myth, somewhere at the eastern edge of the known world along the shores of the Black Sea, and whose queen wore a belt given to her by the war god Ares himself, as a mark of her authority over her whole fierce and formidable people, a belt Eurystheus wanted in this particular telling for his own daughter, who had heard tales of the Amazon Queen's legendary battle honours and wanted the belt as her own prized possession. Heracles sailed to the land of the Amazons with a company of companions, and what happened next is worth pausing on carefully, because in nearly every version of this story, the labour very nearly resolved itself without any violence at all, in a way that stands in real, pointed contrast to almost every other confrontation in this entire cycle. Hippolyta, meeting Heracles and hearing his request, was genuinely impressed by his reputation and his evident honesty about why he had come, and agreed, freely and without any resistance whatsoever, to simply give him the belt as a gift, understanding that he was acting under a compulsion not of his own choosing, and bearing him no ill will for the request itself. It was Hera, watching this whole peaceful exchange unfold and unable as ever to bear the sight of one of her husband's mortal children succeeding at anything without cost, who intervened directly, disguising herself as one of the Amazon women, and spreading a rumour through the whole camp that the strange foreign visitors were not there to trade peacefully at all, but intended to kidnap their queen, a lie that spread through the Amazon warriors with exactly the speed and the fury such an accusation was designed to provoke, and the Amazons, believing their queen to be in immediate danger, armed themselves and attacked Heracles' ship without warning. Heracles, seeing what appeared, from his own perspective, to be a sudden and unprovoked assault by the very people who had just peacefully agreed to his request, and having no way of knowing that a goddess's deliberate lie stood behind it, reacted with exactly the violence his own instincts and training had prepared him for, believing Hippolyta herself had betrayed him and ordered the attack, and in the chaotic battle that followed, he killed the queen who had, only moments before, offered him her most treasured possession freely and in good faith, taking the belt at last not as a gift, but as plunder from a woman he had never actually needed to fight at all. It is worth pausing on this labour for a long moment, because it is one of the clearest illustrations in this entire cycle of exactly how Hera's persecution actually functioned across Heracles' whole life, not merely as a series of monsters thrown directly in his path, which he could face and, given enough strength and cleverness, generally overcome, but as something far more insidious, a goddess willing to manufacture entire false realities, entire fabricated betrayals, specifically engineered to trigger the one flaw in this otherwise nearly invincible hero that she knew, better than anyone, she could always rely on. A temper that responded to perceived threat with immediate, overwhelming and fatally irreversible force before there was ever a chance to learn whether the threat was even real. Cattle at the edge of the world and a three-bodied giant. The 10th labour sent Heracles further than any previous task had required, to the island of Erythea, which the old sources place at the very western edge of the known world, near where the Atlantic Ocean was believed to begin, to steal the famous red cattle of a giant named Geryon, a monstrous figure born with 3 separate bodies joined together at the waist, each with its own complete set of limbs and guarded by a two-headed dog named Orthrus, himself a sibling of the Cerberus we will meet later tonight, and by a giant herdsman named Eurytion. The journey there alone produced one of the more memorable and more geographically ambitious episodes in this whole cycle, because Heracles, finding the heat of the journey through the deserts of Libya unbearable, is said to have grown so frustrated with the sun god Helios's own blazing chariot passing overhead that he actually drew his bow and threatened to shoot the sun itself out of the sky. A piece of pure, magnificent hubris that Helios, remarkably, met not with anger, but with genuine admiration for the mortal's sheer audacity, lending Heracles his own great golden cup, the very vessel in which the sun god sailed each night back across the encircling river of ocean to his eastern starting point, so that Heracles could use it as a boat across the vast waters separating him from Gerion's island. A strange and rather beautiful image. A mortal hero borrowing the sun's own private ferry to continue a labour that had already carried him to the very edge of the mapped world. Once he reached the island, Heracles dispatched the guard dog Orthrus and the herdsman Eurytion with comparatively little difficulty, and it was Geryon himself, alerted to the theft of his cattle, who presented the real challenge of this labour, a three-bodied giant of such size and strength that an ordinary confrontation might well have overwhelmed even Heracles, and it was here that the poisoned arrows first prepared back at the swamp of Lerna proved their worth in a way that went beyond mere convenience, because Heracles, drawing his bow, managed to line up a single shot that passed through all three of Geryon's joined bodies at once, killing the giant with one arrow where an ordinary weapon might have required three separate mortal wounds delivered simultaneously to bring him down. The return journey with the stolen cattle proved nearly as eventful as the labour itself, a long and difficult drive across much of the known world back to Eurystheus' court in Greece, during which Heracles is credited, in various local traditions that grew up around this same journey, with any number of smaller adventures and foundings, including, by later Roman tradition, an encounter in Italy with a fire-breathing monster named Cacus, who stole some of the cattle and was killed for it near the very hills where Rome would one day stand, a local legend we actually touched on briefly in another story told in this room, concerning a Trojan exile who once heard the same tale from an old king showing him around a humble settlement on those same future Roman hills, golden apples at the world's edge, and a titan tricked into keeping his own burden. The 11th labour, and Eurystheus' response to it, tells us something important about how this whole cycle of tasks had, by this point, evolved well beyond its original purpose, because Eurystheus, having by now had several of Heracles' completed labours disqualified on various technicalities, real or invented, and finding himself running short of monsters left to send his servant against, set him a task of a different character entirely, to retrieve the golden apples that grew in the garden of the Hesperides, nymphs of the evening said to be daughters of the Titan Atlas, a garden that lay at the very western edge of the world and was guarded by a dragon named Ladon coiled permanently around the tree itself, apples that had been a wedding gift from the earth goddess Gaia to Hera, on the occasion of her own marriage to Zeus, making this labour, in a detail worth pausing on, a theft directly from the goddess who had spent Heracles' entire life trying to destroy him. The difficulty of this labour was not merely the dragon, formidable as it was, but the simple fact that Heracles, for all his travelling across the known world in the previous 10 labours, did not actually know where this garden was located at all, and the story that follows, in its most commonly told version, shows him solving that problem through exactly the kind of patient, roundabout cleverness this whole tradition keeps crediting him with whenever brute strength alone will not serve. He sought out and wrestled information from Nereus, an ancient and shape-shifting sea god who knew the location of every hidden place in the world, but who would only surrender that knowledge to a mortal capable of holding on to him through every transformation he attempted, and Heracles, gripping the god through form after form, serpent and lion and rushing water and licking flame, refused to let go until Nereus finally relented and told him the way. Arriving at last near the garden itself, Heracles encountered Atlas, the Titan condemned, in a punishment we will discuss at greater length in another story told in this room concerning the war between the gods and the Titans to hold up the sky itself on his own shoulders for all eternity. And it was Atlas, as the actual father of the nymphs who tended this same garden, whom Heracles approached with a proposition rather than attempting to steal the apples himself past a dragon whose exact nature and vulnerabilities he had no clear knowledge of. Heracles offered to take on the crushing weight of the sky himself, temporarily, if Atlas would use his own paternal authority to simply walk into the garden, deal with the dragon or his own daughters as needed, and fetch the apples personally, a bargain Atlas, weary beyond imagining after who knows how many centuries of unbroken labour, accepted with something like desperate relief. What followed is one of the most quietly satisfying pieces of trickery in this whole tradition, because Atlas, once free of his burden and holding the golden apples in his own hands, was in no hurry at all to take the sky back onto his shoulders, suggesting instead, with a casualness that must have been almost unbearable for Heracles to hear given what it implied, that he himself would simply carry the apples the rest of the way to Eurystheus, leaving Heracles to hold up the sky in his place forever. Heracles, understanding immediately the trap he'd walked into, responded with a piece of cleverness that matches anything else in this entire cycle of labours, agreeing readily to Atlas's proposal but asking only for a brief moment to adjust the padding on his own shoulders before the weight was transferred back, since the sky, he explained, was pressing uncomfortably and he wished to arrange a cushion first, and Atlas, seeing nothing suspicious in so reasonable a request, took the sky back onto his own shoulders for just that one moment, at which point Heracles simply picked up the apples from the ground where Atlas had set them and walked away, leaving the Titan exactly where he had found him, condemned once again to his own eternal burden, outwitted by the very mortal he had thought to trick in turn. It is worth pausing on this single episode because it is one of the very few labours in this entire cycle that Heracles resolves through pure cunning alone, without a single blow struck or a single drop of blood spilled, a labour won entirely by conversation and by a clever man's careful reading of another, wearier being's own desperate hopes, and it stands as a useful reminder this late in the cycle that whatever popular memory has reduced this hero down to, brute strength alone was never actually the whole of what made him formidable. A hound with 3 heads and the very last labour of all. The 12th and final labour, by every ancient account the most difficult and the most dreadful of the entire cycle, sent Heracles down into the underworld itself to capture and bring back, alive and without any weapon used against him, Cerberus, the monstrous 3-headed hound who guarded the gates of the dead, preventing the living from entering uninvited and preventing the dead from ever leaving again. A task Eurystheus set, the old sources suggest, in the genuine hope that this final labour might finally succeed where 9 years of monsters and giants had failed, and simply kill his hated servant once and for all, since no mortal, by any ordinary reckoning, should have been able to walk into the realm of the dead and walk back out again carrying its own guardian on a leash. Before Heracles could even attempt the capture itself, he first had to be properly initiated into the Eleusinian Mysteries, a set of secret religious rites practiced at the city of Eleusis near Athens that we have mentioned in passing in another story told in this room. Because those rites alone were believed to prepare a living person's soul to enter the realm of the dead and return from it safely, and it is worth pausing on this small detail, because it reminds us that even the strongest man in the entire Greek world could not simply force his way into the underworld on muscle alone, but needed first the same kind of proper religious preparation that any ordinary mortal seeking safe passage through death's own domain would have required. Descending at last through a chasm near Tainaron, on the southern tip of the Greek mainland, Heracles found the underworld populated by many of the same figures that another wandering hero would encounter. In an entirely separate story we spent an entire night on in this room, when he too descended briefly to consult the dead, and it is worth pausing on a few of those encounters here, because they connect this whole cycle of labours to threads running through other stories in this tradition. He met the ghost of the Gorgon Medusa, whom another hero would one day behead in a story of his own, and was warned that her image alone, even as a mere shadow among the dead, retained enough of its old power that he nearly drew his sword against it, before the god Hermes, accompanying him as a guide, reminded him that the dead could no longer truly harm him, and there was no need to fight a mere reflection of a danger already ended. More significantly, he encountered the heroes Theseus and Pirate House, trapped and bound to a rock in the underworld as punishment for their own reckless attempt, some time before, to kidnap the goddess Persephone herself from her husband Hades, and Heracles, in an act of real compassion that this tradition takes real care to note, managed to free Theseus from his bonds through sheer strength, tearing him loose from the rock that held him, though when he attempted the same rescue for Pirate House, the earth itself shook so violently in protest that Heracles understood he was meant to leave that second man to his own deserved punishment. A small, telling detail about the limits even this hero's own strength was permitted to exceed. A reminder that even in the one realm where his own overwhelming power might have seemed to answer for everything, some doors, this whole tradition insists, remain closed to force alone, however great that force might be, and open only to whatever measure of genuine justice the offence underneath them actually deserves. Reaching Hades and Persephone themselves, rulers of the whole realm of the dead, Heracles asked permission, rather than simply attempting to seize what he had come for by force, to borrow Cerberus for the purpose of his labour, and Hades granted the request on a single condition, that Heracles subdue the great hound using nothing but his own bare hands, no weapon of any kind, and it was under those terms that Heracles wrestled the three-headed guardian of the dead into submission, exactly as he had once wrestled the Nemean lion at the very start of this whole cycle, gripping the beast around its middle neck and holding on through the thrashing and the biting of all three heads, and the venomous serpent that some tell-ins say grew from the end of its own tail until Cerberus finally yielded. Heracles carried the great hound bodily up out of the underworld and back into the world of the living, and Eurystheus, seeing the very guardian of the dead itself being marched into his own palace courtyard, is said to have reacted with the single most complete terror of this entire decade, begging Heracles to take the monster away and return it to its proper place at once, and Heracles did exactly that, carrying Cerberus back down to the underworld and releasing him again at his post, the labour completed, the debt, at long last, fully and finally discharged, 10 years, or by some counts 12, of monsters and giants and grieving losses along the way, brought at last to their appointed end, a chained titan set free at last. It is worth pausing here, before we follow Heracles into the years of his life that came after the 12 labours were finally finished, to close a thread this story opened many chapters ago and never quite finished, because one of the most quietly moving episodes in this whole tradition belongs to exactly this moment in Heracles' timeline, even though the story it concludes actually began long before Heracles himself was ever born. You will recall Prometheus, the titan who stole fire from the gods and gave it to humanity, a story we may well tell in full on another night in this room, and whom Zeus punished by chaining to a remote mountainside where an eagle came every single day without fail to tear open his side and devour his liver, which grew back whole again by nightfall only to be devoured all over again the following day, an agony designed, with real and deliberate cruelty, to never end. Heracles, travelling through that same remote region in the course of his own wide-ranging adventures, came upon the chained titan and, moved by a suffering that even his own tormented life had never quite matched in sheer duration, killed the eagle with a single arrow and broke the chains that had held Prometheus bound for so many generations of mortal lifetimes, an act Zeus permitted, remarkably, because enough time had passed and enough of the original offence had been symbolically answered that the king of the gods was willing, by this point, to let his own son perform the actual liberation. It was in the aftermath of this same rescue, in the version of the story many later sources prefer, that Chiron, still suffering his own endless, incurable agony from the poisoned wound Heracles had accidentally inflicted on him so many labours before, was finally permitted to trade his own unwanted immortality to Prometheus in exchange for Prometheus's own mortality, allowing the wise old centaur at last the mercy of an actual death and an end to his suffering, while Prometheus, granted immortality in return, was fully and finally welcomed back among the ranks of the gods he had once defied. It is worth pausing on the quiet symmetry of that whole exchange, an old wound Heracles caused by accident, healed at last by an act of deliberate mercy performed by the very same hands, a small circle of grief finally closed, a war among giants, and the one prophecy only a mortal could satisfy. It is worth pausing, too, on an episode that this whole tradition treats as by far the largest and most cosmically important thing Heracles ever did, larger, in its own way, than any single one of the 12 labours, even though popular memory today has mostly let it fade, because it is the one moment in this entire story where Heracles' own strange doubled nature, half god and half mortal, was not merely a personal misfortune inherited from a deceptive night in his mother's bedroom, but the single deciding factor in whether the gods of Olympus themselves would continue to rule the universe at all. Long before Zeus and his fellow Olympians secured their own rule by overthrowing the elder Titans, in a story we may tell in full on another night in this room, the earth goddess Gaia had already produced a second and even more monstrous generation of offspring, the giants, enormous and nearly unkillable beings born specifically in some tellings out of Gaia's own fury at the imprisonment of her Titan children, and it had been prophesied from the very earliest days of the gods' own rule that these giants could never be killed by the gods alone, no matter how many thunderbolts or tridents were turned against them, but only through the combined effort of a god striking alongside a single mortal hero. A prophecy that made the entire future safety of Olympus depend, in a way none of the Olympians particularly enjoyed admitting, on the existence of exactly the kind of half-mortal offspring that Zeus's own long habit of infidelity had produced. When the giants finally rose up in open war against Olympus, hurling boulders and flaming trees at the gods themselves in a battle the old sources describe on a scale that dwarfs even the destruction of Troy, it was Heracles, already renowned by that point for his labours, whom the gods summoned to fight alongside them, and it was Heracles' own arrows, and no other weapon in the entire war, that delivered the final, fatal blow to giant after giant, whom the gods had already wounded but could not, on their own divine strength alone, finish off, a giant named Alcyoneus among them, who could not even be killed while he stood on the particular stretch of his own native soil that had granted him a strange local invulnerability, until Heracles, on Athena's own advice, dragged him bodily off that ground before finishing him, echoing in a detail worth noticing the very same trick he would later use against the giant Antaeus, whose own invulnerability drew from contact with the earth in exactly the same way. It is worth pausing on what this single episode tells us about everything else in tonight's story, because it means that the very quality that made Heracles' own life so uniquely miserable, a mortal body vulnerable to poison and exhaustion and grief, housing a portion of divine strength that no ordinary human being could match, was also, from the perspective of the gods themselves, the single indispensable thing standing between an ordered universe and total cosmic catastrophe. Zeus's own careless infidelity, and Hera's own vindictive response to it, had between them produced, without either god fully intending it, the one creature in the entire universe capable of saving that same universe's own ruling order. A strange and rather bitter irony that this whole tradition never quite resolves into anything so simple as gratitude on Hera's part, since her own persecution of Heracles continued for decades after this war, regardless of how much Olympus itself owed to his participation in it. A brief voyage with the Argonauts, and a young companion lost to a spring. Heracles' life did not consist entirely of labours assigned by Eurystheus, and it is worth pausing on one of the more famous adventures that fell outside that specific decade, because it connects this whole story to another great cycle of Greek myth we may tell in full, one night in this room. When the hero Jason assembled his crew of the Argo to sail in search of the Golden Fleece, Heracles was counted by nearly every ancient telling among the volunteers, his reputation by that point so towering that no expedition of this scale could be imagined without him, and he sailed with Jason's crew for a portion of that journey before an episode occurred that removed him from the voyage entirely, in a manner this whole tradition treats with genuine tenderness rather than any diminishment of his own reputation. Heracles had brought along, as his own companion and beloved attendant, a young man named Hylas, and when the Argo put in at a shore to take on fresh water, Hylas went alone to a spring to fill a jug, and was pulled down into the water and drowned, or in the gentler telling simply spirited away forever, by water nymphs who had fallen instantly in love with his beauty the moment they glimpsed his reflection in their own pool. Heracles, hearing his companions cry and searching frantically through the surrounding woods, calling his name long after any hope of finding him alive had passed, refused to abandon the search, even as the rest of the Argonauts, waiting on favourable winds, made the decision to sail on without him, leaving Heracles behind on that shore, still calling for a boy who was never going to answer, a small aching episode of loss that this whole tradition treats with real weight, despite its brevity, and one more reminder of how often this hero's own story, whatever its scale of monsters and labours, kept circling back to grief over some single beloved companion lost along the way, a wrestler who drew strength from the earth, and a king who fed his guests to his own altar. Heracles' travels in the years surrounding his labours brought him into contact with a great many lesser monsters and tyrants beyond the 12 official tasks, and 2 of these encounters are worth pausing on, because they show this same pattern of cleverness paired with strength that had already served him so well against Atlas and the Stymphalian birds. In Libya, he was challenged by a giant named Antaeus, a son of the earth goddess Gaia herself, who forced every traveller passing through his territory to wrestle him, a contest that had killed every single challenger before Heracles arrived, because Antaeus drew his own strength directly from contact with the earth, growing stronger with every fall rather than weaker, so that throwing him to the ground, the ordinary aim of any wrestling match, only renewed him rather than defeating him. Heracles, recognising the trick after his own first few throws left the giant somehow more formidable rather than less, solved the problem by lifting Antaeus bodily off the ground entirely and crushing him to death in a mid-air embrace, denying him any further contact with the mother who had made him invincible in the first place. A solution that depends, once again, on quick observation and clever adaptation, rather than on strength used blindly. It is worth pausing too on one further encounter from these same wandering years, because it is one of the gentlest and most quietly beautiful episodes in this entire tradition, standing out precisely for how little violence it actually requires. Travelling through Thessaly, Heracles came as a guest to the household of a king named Admetus, and found the whole palace shrouded in a grief its own master was trying, out of simple hospitality, to hide from his famous visitor, because Admetus's own wife, Alcestis, had agreed, under a strange bargain the fates themselves had once granted her husband, to die in his place when his own appointed hour of death arrived, and that hour had come only that same day, so that Heracles was being welcomed, feasted, and entertained by a household that had, in fact, just lost its own queen only hours before, a courtesy of hospitality so complete that Admetus refused to let his own grief spoil his guests' welcome. Heracles, learning the truth only after his own feasting was already finished, and mortified that he had been drinking and making merry in a house of fresh mourning, resolved to repay his host's hidden generosity in the only way his own particular gifts allowed, going to the very tomb where Alcestis had just been laid and waiting there for death himself, called Thanatos in the old sources, to come and claim his usual portion of blood from the funeral offerings, and when Thanatos arrived, Heracles seized him bodily and wrestled him exactly as he had once wrestled the Nemean lion, and would one day wrestle Cerberus at the gates of the underworld itself, forcing the god of death to release his claim on Alcestis' own life, and returning her, alive and well, to her astonished husband, a labour Heracles performed for no oracle and no king's command at all, but simply as a private act of gratitude for one night's undeserved kindness. And it is worth holding this small, gentle episode alongside everything else in tonight's story, because it shows us, if only once, a Heracles whose overwhelming strength was turned toward pure, uncompensated generosity, rather than toward atonement or survival, wrestling death itself not because he had to, but simply because he wanted to give something back. In Egypt, Heracles encountered a king named Busiris, who had been told by an oracle that his land's ongoing famine would only end if he sacrificed a foreign visitor to the gods every single year, a practice he had continued faithfully for 9 years by the time Heracles happened to pass through his kingdom, and Busiris, seeing in this famous foreign hero an especially prestigious offering, had him seized and bound for the altar, only to discover, once the ceremony actually began, that Heracles could break any bonds placed on him with contemptuous ease, and he killed Busiris and his own priests on the very altar they had prepared for him, ending a decade of ritual murder with a single afternoon of well-deserved violence, a king who would not pay for a rescued daughter, and the first fall of Troy. It is worth pausing on one further adventure, because it connects Heracles' own story directly to the city, and the war we have discussed at real length on other nights in this room, since Troy, long before it ever burned in the war that gave us the Iliad, burned once already, at Heracles' own hands, in a story most modern audiences have never heard at all. The sea god Poseidon and the god Apollo, having offended Zeus in some earlier quarrel, were once condemned to serve for a year as mortal labourers under King Laomedon of Troy. The very city whose walls, in the story we told on another night in this room, were said to have been built by gods, and it was during this same service that the two gods, together, raised those famous walls, only for Laomedon, once the year of service ended, to refuse the payment he had promised them, a betrayal of hospitality and contract that the gods punished by sending a sea monster to ravage the Trojan coastline and demanding, as the only remedy an oracle could offer, that Laomedon's own daughter, a princess named Hesione, be chained to a rock by the shore as a sacrifice to placate the beast. Heracles, passing that coastline on his way back from one of his own labours, found Hesione chained and waiting for a monster that was already approaching, and offered to kill the beast and save her in exchange for a reward of his own, a pair of immortal horses that Zeus had once given Laomedon as compensation for an earlier grievance involving Laomedon's own son Ganymede, whom we mentioned in another story told in this room as the beautiful young prince carried off to serve as cupbearer on Olympus. Laomedon agreed eagerly, and Heracles killed the sea monster and freed Hesione exactly as he had promised, only to find, in a pattern that this whole story keeps returning to with a kind of weary, bitter regularity, that Laomedon, exactly like Augeas before him with his filthy stables, simply refused to honour the bargain once the actual danger had passed. Heracles, unlike his response to Augeas' own broken promise, did not let this particular betrayal go unanswered, returning some years later with an army, sacking the city of Troy in a raid that predates the far more famous war by an entire generation, killing Laomedon himself and placing a young son of his, a boy who would grow up to become King Priam, the very ruler whose death we have already discussed at length in another story told in this room, on the Trojan throne in his father's place, a whole thread of consequence stretching from one broken promise on a beach all the way to the war that would one day burn that same city to the ground for good. A year spent in silk, spinning wool at a foreign queen's command. It is worth pausing before we come to the story's final and most devastating turn, on one further episode that later ages, particularly Roman and Renaissance artists, found endlessly fascinating because it shows Heracles in a condition almost nobody associates with him at all. Humbled, feminized, and stripped, for a time, of every trapping of the heroic identity this whole story has spent so long building. After a separate act of violence, the murder of a man named Iphitus in a fit of the same uncontrolled rage that had already killed his own music teacher, and, in a far more terrible form, his own children, Heracles was condemned by the oracle at Delphi to a fresh period of servitude as punishment, sold this time into slavery for a full year to Omphale, queen of Lydia in Asia Minor. Omphale, the old sources tell us, delighted in humbling her famous captive, dressing him in women's clothing and setting him to work at the loom and the spindle alongside her own female attendants, spinning wool and performing the same domestic tasks traditionally reserved for women in that world, while she herself, in a deliberate and pointed reversal that later artists loved to depict, wore his lion's skin and carried his great club. And it is worth pausing on how deliberately this whole episode inverts everything this story has built Heracles up to be across every single labour we have already described tonight. The strongest man in the world reduced for one full year to the most conventionally powerless and domestic role his own culture could imagine, a humiliation this tradition treats not as a joke at his expense alone, but as one more genuine debt paid for one more genuine crime. Exactly the same pattern of atonement through service that has run through this entire story since the oracle first sent him to Eurystheus' court so many years before: a jealous wife, a dying centaur's revenge, and a shirt soaked in poisoned blood. We come now to the final turn of this whole long story, and it is worth telling it slowly and carefully, because it closes this entire tale with an irony so complete and so deliberately constructed by the tradition that told it, that it deserves the same weight we gave to the death of Heracles' own children so many chapters ago. After the events of Omphale's household, Heracles remarried, taking as his second wife a princess named Deianira, whom he had won, in one telling, by wrestling and defeating a river god named Achelous, who could change his own shape at will, exactly the same kind of shape-shifting contest that had once helped him win directions to the garden of the Hesperides from the sea god Nereus. It was on the journey home with his new bride that Heracles encountered a centaur named Nessus, working as a ferryman at a river crossing too dangerous for Deianira to attempt on foot, and Heracles, unable to carry his own wife across the water himself while also managing their baggage, paid Nessus to carry her across on his own back while Heracles swam the river separately. And it was during that crossing that Nessus, alone with Deianira and out of Heracles' immediate reach, attempted to assault her. And Heracles, reaching the far bank and seeing what was happening, drew his bow and shot the centaur through the chest with one of his own poisoned arrows, the same arrows dipped so many labours before in the venomous blood of the Lernaean Hydra. Nessus, dying from a wound that no creature could survive, used his own final moments not for any ordinary act of vengeance but for a piece of calculated, patient cruelty that would not bear its fruit for years, telling Deianira with his dying breath a lie dressed up as a gift, that if she gathered a portion of his own blood, now mixed with the Hydra's poison from the arrow that killed him, and kept it safely hidden away, she would possess a potion powerful enough to guarantee her husband's love forever, restoring his affection instantly should it ever begin to wander toward another woman. Deianira, believing this dying gift to be genuine, and having no way of knowing that the very poison already coursing through Nessus's own veins made every word of his promise a calculated act of revenge against the man who had killed him, collected some of the tainted blood, and kept it hidden away, waiting for a day she hoped would never actually come. That day arrived years later, and it is worth telling the story of exactly how Heracles came to possess this particular captive princess in the first place, because it closes a circle. This whole story opened all the way back in its very earliest chapter. You will recall Eurytus, the renowned archer who had once taught the young Heracles the use of the bow back in the peaceful years before the killing of his music teacher Linus, ever sent him away to be raised among the herdsmen of the countryside. Years later, now a grown man already famous across the whole Greek world for his labours, Heracles returned to that same teacher's court to compete for the hand of Eurytus' own daughter, a princess named Iole, in an archery contest Eurytus himself had announced, promising his daughter's hand to any suitor who could outshoot him with the very weapon he had once taught Heracles to use. Heracles won the contest decisively, besting his own former teacher at the very skill that teacher had given him, but Eurytus, fearing what a repeat of Heracles' own earlier, uncontrolled madness might one day mean for his daughter's safety inside his own household, refused to honour the wager, sending Heracles away without his promised bride in a betrayal that echoes, with real deliberateness, the broken bargains of Algaias and Laomedon we have already discussed tonight. Heracles did not forget the insult, and years later, in the same campaign that finally brought Iole into his possession, he returned to Eurytus' city of Oechalia with an army, sacked it, killed Eurytus and his sons, and took Iole captive as the very prize he had originally been promised and denied. And it was this same act, according to several of the ancient sources, that made his own growing affection for her plain enough that word of it reached Deianira before Heracles himself ever returned home, and Deianira, fearing she was about to lose her husband's love entirely to a younger and more celebrated captive, remembered the centaur's dying promise and prepared a shirt for Heracles' return, soaking the fabric in the blood she had so carefully preserved, believing she was securing his devotion rather than preparing, without any understanding of what she was actually doing, the very instrument of his death. Heracles put on the shirt to perform a sacrifice in thanks for his latest victory, and the poison, warmed and activated by the heat of the sacrificial fire and by his own body's own warmth, began to burn into his skin with an agony beyond anything even this hero's own famously enormous capacity for suffering could withstand. A poison so virulent, drawn originally from a monster whose blood had already proven capable of killing an immortal centaur through nothing more than an accidental scratch, that it fused the fabric of the shirt directly into Heracles' own flesh, and every attempt to tear it free tore his own skin away with it. And Heracles, in an agony the old sources describe in language of genuine and unflinching horror, understood in that same moment exactly who had made this shirt and exactly why, and forgave her instantly and completely once he learned that she had acted in ignorance rather than malice. A forgiveness that came, unfortunately, only after Deianira herself, upon learning what her own well-meaning gift had actually done to the husband she loved, had already taken her own life in horror and grief at what she had unknowingly caused. It is worth pausing on the terrible closed circle this final betrayal completes, because it draws together threads this story has been laying since its very earliest chapters. The poison that killed Heracles came from the Hydra, the second labour of his own long atonement. The vehicle of its delivery was a centaur, the same race whose earlier encounter had already cost the lives of Pholus and very nearly Chiron. And the hand that unknowingly delivered the fatal blow belonged not to any monster or any god, but to a wife who loved him, acting on the advice of the very creature Heracles himself had killed in her own defence. A poison born from Heracles' own hand, delivered by a wife's own trusting love, closing a loop that this whole tradition seems to have constructed with real, deliberate care. That a man who survived every monster the world could throw at him was finally undone not by any external enemy at all, but by the compounding, decades-long consequences of his own past violence, circling back around to find him at the one moment he had let his guard down entirely. A pyre on a mountain, and a man who chose his own ending. Understanding that the poison had fused itself permanently into his own body, and that no cure existed anywhere in the mortal world for a wound delivered by the Hydra's own blood, Heracles made a decision that this whole tradition treats with genuine and considerable respect, refusing to simply waste away in slow, uncontrolled agony over days or weeks, and instead had himself carried to the summit of Mount Uta, where he ordered a great funeral pyre built and asked to be laid upon it while he was still living, choosing, in effect, the manner and the moment of his own death, rather than allowing the poison to make that choice for him. No one among his own gathered companions and followers could bring themselves to actually light the fire beneath a man they loved and admired, and it was only a young archer named Philoctetes, or in some tellings Philoctetes' own father Poeas, who finally agreed to strike the flame, and Heracles, in gratitude for a mercy no one else present could bring themselves to grant him, gave the young man his own bow and his own supply of the very poisoned arrows that had, across this whole long story, killed monsters and giants and centaurs and unfaithful kings alike, a bow and arrows that would matter enormously, decades later, in the war at Troy we have discussed at such length in another story told in this room, because it was prophesied that Troy could never fall without this same weapon, and Philoctetes himself, or his descendants carrying that same bow, would eventually be summoned to that later war for exactly that reason. As the flames rose around him, the old sources tell us, something extraordinary happened that this whole tradition presents as the final, long-delayed payment of the promise Zeus had made all those decades before, back at the very moment Heracles' servitude to Eurystheus first began. The mortal portion of Heracles' own nature, inherited from his mother Alcmene, burned away in the fire along with all his ordinary human suffering, while the immortal portion, inherited from his true father Zeus, rose up out of the flames in a chariot and was carried to Olympus itself, where Heracles was welcomed, at long last, into the full company of the gods, granted the very immortality his own decades of suffering and service had been promised as their ultimate reward from the moment his life first went so catastrophically wrong. It is worth pausing on what happened next among the gods themselves, because it closes out, in the gentlest and most surprising way this whole tradition ever manages, the very hostility that had driven every single tragedy of Heracles' entire mortal life. Hera herself, who had pursued this one man with a focused, patient cruelty from the moment of his birth, through the death of his own children, and every labour and betrayal that followed, is said, in the version of this story that later ages found most satisfying, to have finally set aside her ancient grudge, once Heracles' mortal nature had burned away entirely, formally adopting him in a strange and rather moving ritual some versions describe as a symbolic rebirth through her own body, and giving him in marriage her own daughter, Hebe, the goddess of eternal youth, so that the very goddess who had spent an entire mortal lifetime trying to destroy this man ended the story, against every expectation her earlier cruelty might have led an audience to hold, as his own reconciled and welcoming mother-in-law among the gods. It is worth sitting with that ending for a long moment, because it is genuinely one of the strangest reconciliations in the whole of Greek mythology, a persecution this total and this sustained simply set down, in the end, once its object had finally been transformed beyond the reach of any further harm, and it asks us, in its own quiet way, to consider whether that reconciliation actually redeems everything that came before it, the strangled infancy, the murdered children, the poisoned centaur's revenge delivered through a loving wife's own unknowing hand, or whether some things, once done, remain undone no matter what peace eventually follows them. A question. This whole story, characteristically, does not answer for us directly, leaving it instead for each listener to weigh on their own. Children left behind, and a myth that later conquerors found extremely useful. Before we turn to how the wider Greek and Roman worlds actually worshipped Heracles once his own story reached its end, it is worth pausing on his own children, because across his many marriages and countless other unions this whole tradition records, with a bluntness modern audiences sometimes find startling, Heracles fathered a great many sons and daughters known collectively as the Heracleidae, the children of Heracles, and one line of that same descent went on to serve a political purpose in actual, documented Greek history so useful that it is worth setting beside everything we noticed earlier tonight about how Aeneas's own descent from a goddess was put to work, legitimizing an emperor centuries after that particular myth was first told. After Heracles' death, Eurystheus, still nursing decades of resentment against the man he had been forced, against every natural order of birthright, to command for a full 10 years, turned his fear and his hatred against Heracles' own surviving children instead, driving them out of the Peloponnese and pursuing them from city to city until they found refuge, at last, in Athens, where the Athenians, in a war this tradition treats as one of the more genuinely heroic moments in their own city's mythic history, fought and defeated Eurystheus' own forces and killed him, finally ending, one full generation after Heracles' own death, the very persecution that had shaped his entire life. Heracles' own eldest son by Deianira, a young man named Hyllus, and his descendants after him spent years in exile trying, and repeatedly failing, to reclaim by force the very Peloponnesian kingdoms that ought, by every rule of hereditary right this tradition takes seriously, to have belonged to their own father's bloodline in the first place, since Heracles himself, remember, had been cheated of his own rightful inheritance before he was even born. It is worth pausing here, because this particular thread of the myth stopped being merely a story at some point and became instead a piece of genuine and consequential political propaganda, in a way this whole channel has learned to watch for after spending an entire night, not long ago in this room, examining exactly how Augustus once used a very similar genealogical claim to legitimize his own rule over Rome, sometime around the 12th century before Christ, by the traditional Greek reckoning, though the actual historical process almost certainly unfolded far more gradually and far less dramatically than any single myth could capture. A wave of Greek-speaking peoples calling themselves Dorians moved into and eventually came to dominate much of the Peloponnese, including the powerful city of Sparta itself, displacing or absorbing the populations that had lived there before, and the Dorian kings who emerged from that upheaval, needing some claim more dignified than simple conquest to justify their own new authority over lands they had not originally held, seized on exactly the story we have just finished telling, declaring themselves the literal, returned descendants of Hyllus and the other exiled children of Heracles, finally reclaiming, after so many generations of wandering and injustice, the very kingdoms that had always belonged to their own ancestor by right. This event, which the Greeks themselves called the return of the Heracleidae, functioned for Spartan and other Dorian royal houses across the whole of the following classical period, exactly the way Aeneas's own descent from Venus functioned for the Julian family in Rome many centuries later, a myth of ancient, divinely sanctioned entitlement, laid retroactively over what modern historians generally understand to have been a far messier and far less glamorous process of migration, conquest, and gradual cultural change. And it is worth noticing once again how readily this whole ancient world reached for exactly the same narrative tool whenever a new ruling power needed to explain why its own authority over a given stretch of land was not merely seized, but somehow owed to it all along. Heracles himself, a hero whose entire mortal life had been defined by being cheated out of a birthright that was rightfully his, ended up serving, for centuries after his own death, as the mythic guarantee of birthright for an entire ruling class of later kings who traced their own claim to power through exactly the injustice that had once made his own life so miserable in the first place. Where this whole story actually comes from. It is worth pausing too before we trace this tradition's long afterlife to say a word about where the version of this story we have told tonight actually survives, because unlike the Iliad, or the Odyssey, or Virgil's own Aeneid, which each come down to us as a single unified poem from a single identifiable author, the story of Heracles reaches us in fragments, scattered across centuries of Greek and Roman writing, with no one ancient poet ever having attempted to gather the whole, sprawling cycle into one continuous epic, the way Homer had done for the war at Troy. The earliest layer of this tradition survives mostly in scattered lines of early Greek poetry, a short epic attributed, probably wrongly, to the poet Hesiod, and known as the Shield of Heracles, describing in loving, armour-obsessed detail a shield very much like the one we discussed in the story of Achilles, and brief, tantalizing references scattered through the work of poets like Pindar, who composed odes celebrating athletic victors at exactly the games Heracles was said to have founded at Olympia, and who could not resist weaving the hero's own labours into his praise of the living champions he was actually being paid to honour. The single most complete systematic account of the whole cycle, the one modern scholars still lean on most heavily to reconstruct the labours in something like their traditional order, comes from a much later work called the Bibliotheca, or library, traditionally though almost certainly wrongly attributed to a 2nd century before Christ scholar named Apollodorus, actually compiled by an anonymous later hand drawing together centuries of earlier, now largely lost sources into one tidy encyclopedic summary, the kind of patient scholarly compilation that has quietly preserved an enormous amount of Greek mythology that would otherwise have vanished entirely along with the original poems it was drawn from. Alongside that prose summary, the Athenian tragedians of the 5th century before Christ gave individual episodes of this same story their own full dramatic treatment, Sophocles composing an entire tragedy called The Women of Trachis, built around Deianira's own unwitting role in her husband's death, a play that gives her a far more sympathetic and fully realised inner life than a shorter summary ever could. And Euripides writing both a Heracles that stages the madness and the killing of his children directly on the Athenian stage in unflinching detail, and a stranger, half-comic Alcestis that dramatises exactly the wrestling match with death we described earlier tonight. And it is worth noting, finally, that this whole story did not wait for any of these written accounts to become popular, because the physical archaeological record of Heracles' own image is considerably older than almost any surviving text that describes his adventures in detail. Greek vase painters were already depicting individual labours, the Nemean lion, the Hydra, the theft of the Hesperides apples, on pottery dating back to the 7th century before Christ, generations before Apollodorus or Sophocles or Euripides ever composed a word, and the great temple of Zeus at Olympia, built in the 5th century before Christ at the very sanctuary tradition credited Heracles with founding, was decorated with a continuous sculpted frieze depicting all 12 labours in careful sequence, fragments of which survive and can still be seen today in the museum at Olympia, meaning that visitors to that sacred site in antiquity, walking around the temple's exterior, could trace this entire story with their own eyes, labour by labour, centuries before any single surviving written account had gathered the whole cycle into the neat numbered sequence of 12 that this channel has followed across tonight's long telling. A hero worshipped as something more than a hero. It is worth pausing before we trace this whole story's long afterlife across the centuries since it was first told, to notice something genuinely unusual about how the actual living Greek world treated Heracles once his myth had taken its final shape, because he occupied a religious position that almost no other figure in the entire Greek pantheon quite matched. Most of the great mythic heroes we have discussed in this room, Achilles, Odysseus, even Aeneas in his own later Roman incarnation, received, at most, the kind of respectful hero cult that any exceptional mortal might earn after death, local shrines and annual offerings at a tomb believed to hold their bones, a dignified but fundamentally limited form of religious memory. Heracles alone, among all of them, was worshipped, across the actual historical Greek world, in two entirely separate and technically contradictory ways at once, as a hero in the ordinary sense at some shrines, honoured with the nighttime rites and blood offerings appropriate to the dead, and as a full god in the fullest Olympian sense at others, honoured with daytime sacrifices and altars of the kind normally reserved for Zeus or Athena or Apollo themselves, a doubled religious status that ancient writers themselves noticed and puzzled over, some arguing that two entirely different figures, an early mortal hero and a later divine one, had simply become confused and merged together over the centuries, and others accepting the doubled worship as an accurate reflection of exactly the doubled nature this whole story had given him from the very moment of his conception, half mortal and half divine, even in the manner the wider Greek world chose to honour him. That widespread worship left real, physical traces across the Greek and later Roman world that a curious traveller in antiquity could actually go and visit, and it is worth naming a few of them, because this whole tradition, as we have found again and again in other stories told in this room, was never content to let its heroes live only in the pages of poetry. The great sanctuary of Olympia, home to the Olympic Games that still bear its name today, was said, by strong and persistent local tradition, to have been founded by Hercules himself in thanksgiving, after completing his labour against the Augean stables, credited with measuring out the original length of the stadium track using his own 600 footsteps, and with planting the very olive trees whose branches would, for centuries afterward, crown the game's victorious athletes, so that every 4 years, when the ancient Greek world set aside its wars to gather at Olympia, it was gathering, according to its own founding legend, at a site this exhausted, wandering hero had established with his own 2 feet, further west at the very edge of the Mediterranean where the narrow strait separates Europe from Africa, the twin promontories flanking the entrance to the Atlantic Ocean, one on the Spanish side and one on the African, came to be known throughout antiquity as the Pillars of Hercules, a name tradition connected directly to his 10th labour, the long journey to steal the cattle of Geryon at the very western edge of the known world, with different ancient sources offering different explanations for exactly how the pillars came to be, some claiming Heracles had originally found the strait narrower and had personally widened it to create a passage between the Mediterranean and the outer ocean, others claiming he had instead narrowed an originally wider gap to keep the monsters of the outer ocean from wandering in, but every version agreeing that this single, world-famous stretch of geography, still marked on maps today and still called by that same ancient name in casual speech, owed its identity entirely to this one hero's own farthest labour. It is worth pausing on that same stretch of coastline a little longer, because it connects this story to a piece of much later, thoroughly documented history that this channel finds genuinely irresistible. On the far side of those pillars, on the Atlantic coast of what is now southern Spain, Phoenician traders founded, sometime in the very deep past, a city called Gadir, known to later ages as Gods and to us today as Cadiz, and they built there, on a small island just offshore, a magnificent temple to their own god Melkart, a Phoenician deity of the sea and of long-distance trade whose own attributes, protector of sailors, patron of colonization, a god who was said to die and be reborn each year, overlapped closely enough with the Greek Heracles that Greek and later Roman visitors to that same temple simply identified the 2 figures as one and the same god, wearing 2 different names, an identification so thoroughly accepted across the ancient Mediterranean that Melkart's own great temple at Gades came to be regarded by Greek and Roman writers alike as Heracles' own westernmost shrine, the literal edge of the god's own influence at the very edge of the known world his own 10th labour had once carried him to. It is worth pausing on this identification a little further, because many modern scholars studying the deep prehistory of this whole myth suspect that the connection was not a coincidence invented after the fact, but something closer to the actual seed the Greek story grew from in the first place, since Greek traders and colonists making contact with Phoenician sailors across the eastern Mediterranean, centuries before Homer or Hesiod ever wrote a word down, would have encountered this same Melkart, a far-travelling, monster-fighting, sea-crossing, divine hero, and may well have folded elements of his own worship directly into the figure who eventually became their own Heracles. One more example. Alongside the borrowed Trojan ancestry we discussed at such length in the story of Aeneas, of how thoroughly the supposedly purely Greek mythic tradition actually grew out of centuries of quiet contact and exchange with the older civilizations of the wider Near East, a debt some ancient writers even noticed themselves, with the historian Herodotus reporting, after his own travels to Egypt, that priests there told him of a Heracles worshipped in their own country for many thousands of years, before the Greek version of the same figure was ever born, a claim Herodotus himself found puzzling enough to record without quite knowing what to make of it. And it is worth naming too one further and far later echo of this same temple at Gades, because it reaches all the way into a story we have already told at length in this room. It was at that same shrine to Melkart Heracles, standing on its small island off the coast of Roman Spain, that a young Carthaginian general is said, by more than one ancient historian, to have sworn a solemn oath of eternal enmity against Rome before setting out on the campaign that would carry him across the Alps with his elephants and very nearly end Rome's own existence before it had properly begun. A general named Hannibal, whose whole war against Rome we may recall from the story of Aeneas and the curse of an abandoned Carthaginian queen, was already prophesied in Virgil's own later poem as the destined vengeance of a woman's broken heart. It is worth pausing on that small, strange coincidence of geography, the same stretch of coastline marking both the westernmost reach of Heracles' own ancient labours and the starting point of the very war that Dido's own dying curse had summoned into being. Two entirely separate mythic traditions, Greek and Trojan Roman alike, converging almost by accident on the exact same temple standing at the exact same edge of the known world, a far older king who wept for the very same reasons. It is worth pausing before we leave the ancient Near East entirely to set Heracles' whole story beside an even older one, because this channel has already promised, on another night, to tell the tale of Gilgamesh in full, and the parallels between that far more ancient epic and the story we have spent tonight telling are close enough and old enough that they are worth naming here rather than saving entirely for later. Gilgamesh, the legendary king of the Mesopotamian city of Uruk, whose own story was already being written down on clay tablets more than 1,000 years before Homer's own poems took their final shape, is, by any honest comparison, the oldest surviving ancestor of exactly the kind of hero Heracles would eventually become, a man of superhuman strength who wrestles a monstrous guardian, the forest demon Humbaba, in a contest that reads across 4,000 years of distance, remarkably like Heracles' own wrestling matches with the Nemean lion or the giant Antaeus, a hero who travels to the very edge of the known world seeking answers no ordinary mortal could reach, and a man whose entire later life is reshaped, permanently and unbearably, by grief for a beloved companion, Enkidu, whose death Gilgamesh cannot accept, and whose loss sends him wandering to the edges of the earth, in search of an immortality he will, in the end, never actually secure for himself. It is worth pausing on how closely that shape echoes Heracles' own life, a hero undone not by any monster's claws but by grief for the people he loved, driven, in Gilgamesh's case, to seek out an actual, aging survivor of the world's great flood who might tell him the secret of eternal life, and finding in the end that the secret, once nearly won, slips away from him through nothing more than his own human carelessness, a serpent stealing the plant of immortality while Gilgamesh bathes, exhausted, in a pool along his own road home, leaving him to return to his own city having learned only that mortality cannot, in the end, actually be outrun. A lesson that stands in real and pointed contrast to Heracles' own eventual fate, since Heracles, unlike Gilgamesh, does finally win the immortality that eluded his own far older Mesopotamian predecessor, rising from his funeral pyre into the full company of the gods, rather than returning, empty-handed and mortal, to rule out his own remaining years as a merely human king. This channel does not claim that Homer's own tradition, or the wider Greek storytellers who eventually shaped Heracles into the figure we have spent tonight following, ever read a Mesopotamian clay tablet directly, since the actual channels of transmission across so many centuries and so many intervening cultures remain far too uncertain for any confident claim of direct borrowing to be made responsibly. But the deep, patterned similarity between these two heroes, born in civilizations separated by well over 1,000 years and an entire sea, tells us something worth sitting with regardless. that the shape of this particular story, a man of overwhelming strength undone by grief for someone he loved, wandering to the very edges of the world in search of some answer to mortality itself, was not a Greek invention at all, but one of the oldest and most persistently recurring shapes the human imagination has ever built a hero out of, appearing in its own local costume in nearly every ancient civilization we have ever managed to recover a written record from at all. And it is worth noting, too, how this same religious devotion followed Greek culture directly into the world of actual documented political power. Because Alexander the Great, whose conquest reshaped the entire ancient world within a single decade, traced his own family's royal lineage through the ancient kings of Macedon directly back to Hercules himself, a claim of descent his own dynasty had maintained for generations before Alexander's birth, and that Alexander himself took with evident seriousness, minting coins throughout his own reign that showed, on one face, the god-hero's own unmistakable lion skin headdress, and visiting, according to several ancient historians, shrines and sites associated with Heracles' own legendary travels as he pushed his armies eastward, understanding his own unprecedented conquest of most of the known world, at least in part, as a kind of continuation of the labours his own claimed ancestor had once performed at the very edges of that same world centuries before. An adopted god in a borrowed empire. The Romans, when they came to absorb the Greek pantheon into their own religious practice in the centuries that followed, gave Heracles, under his Latinized name Hercules, a place of genuine and lasting prominence in the very heart of their own capital city, and it is worth pausing on exactly how that adoption happened, because it connects directly back to a story we already touched on earlier tonight. You will recall that Heracles, driving the stolen cattle of Geryon back across the known world during his 10th labour, is said, by later Roman tradition, to have passed through Italy itself and killed a fire-breathing local monster named Cacus, near the very hills where Rome would eventually stand. The same story we heard told, in an entirely different context, in another knight's story concerning a Trojan exile who received a rustic tour of those same future Roman hills from an old exiled Greek king. It was in gratitude for that same local rescue that the earliest inhabitants of that site were said to have built the Aramaxima, the great altar, dedicated to Hercules, a shrine that stood, according to Roman tradition, even before the city of Rome itself was formally founded, making Hercules, by Roman reckoning, one of the very first gods ever worshipped on Roman soil, a status the Romans took seriously enough that the altar's own priesthood remained, for centuries of the actual historical republic, a hereditary honour restricted to two of Rome's own oldest and most distinguished noble families. Hercules went on, across the centuries of the Roman Republic and Empire that followed, to become one of the most popular and most widely depicted figures in the entire Roman religious world, worshipped under titles like Hercules Invictus, the Unconquered, and Hercules Victor, the Victorious, invoked by soldiers before battle and by ordinary merchants hoping for safe and profitable trade. And it is worth noting too that later Roman emperors found in Hercules exactly the same kind of useful, borrowed prestige that Augustus, in a story we told at length on another night in this room, once found in the figure of Aeneas, with the Emperor Commodus, some 2 centuries after Augustus's own reign, going so far as to have himself depicted in official Roman art wearing Hercules' own lion skin and carrying his club, and even renaming the city of Rome itself, for a brief and deeply unpopular period near the end of his own troubled reign, in Hercules' own honour, a piece of imperial self-mythologizing so transparent and so widely resented that it was undone almost immediately after Commodus' own assassination. One more small reminder of how readily this particular hero's borrowed strength could be claimed by rulers who possessed considerably less of it themselves. A body carved in marble, and a labour that never really ended. It is worth tracing briefly how this whole story continued to shape the visual and cultural imagination of the West across the many centuries since the Roman world itself finally came to an end. Because very few figures from the whole of ancient mythology have proven quite so durable or quite so visually irresistible to artists working in entirely different ages and entirely different traditions. Ancient sculptors returned to Hercules' own physical form again and again as the single definitive image of ideal human strength, and one particular Roman marble copy of an earlier Greek original, a colossal, exhausted figure leaning on his own club after completing his labours, discovered buried in the ruins of a Roman bath complex in the 16th century, and known ever since as the Farnese Hercules, became, almost immediately upon its rediscovery, one of the single most studied and most copied sculptures in the entire history of Western art, an image that Renaissance and later academic painters and sculptors treated as something close to a required course of study, a whole tradition of anatomical drawing built in no small part around the effort to understand and reproduce exactly how this one particular imagined body was constructed. The 12 labours themselves, meanwhile, settled permanently into the wider language of the cultures that inherited this story, so thoroughly that the phrase, "a Herculean task," has become, in English and in nearly every other European language descended from this same tradition, simply the ordinary way of describing any undertaking of overwhelming difficulty, a linguistic fossil that most people who use the phrase today have probably never traced back to its actual source. An exhausted, grieving man forced to wrestle lions and clean stables and steal cattle from the edge of the known world as penance for a crime a jealous goddess tricked him into committing. Even the name of an entire Roman town owes itself to this same devotion, since the prosperous seaside city of Herculaneum, buried and preserved beneath the same catastrophic eruption of Vesuvius that destroyed neighbouring Pompeii, a disaster this channel may well tell, in full on another night of its own, took its very name from a local tradition claiming Hercules himself had once founded the settlement in the course of his own wide-ranging travels, so that a town whose ash-buried streets and villas remain to this day one of the richest archaeological windows we possess into ordinary Roman daily life, carries this one exhausted, grieving hero's own name into the present, simply because some ancient local storyteller once decided his footsteps had passed that way. The 20th century, for its own part, inherited this whole story and reshaped it once again to suit an audience that wanted, above nearly everything else, a hero it could feel entirely comfortable rooting for without reservation. An animated feature produced toward the very end of that century, transforming Heracles into a cheerful, well-meaning young man striving to prove himself worthy of Olympus. His own children's deaths quietly erased from the story entirely, along with Megara's own original fate, replaced by a version of her as a living love interest rather than a murdered wife. A choice this channel understands completely as a matter of what a family audience can reasonably be asked to sit with, but one that also means an entire generation grew up believing they knew this hero's story, while never actually encountering the one genuinely unbearable event that gave every single one of his labours its true weight and its true meaning in the first place. And it is worth noting, finally, that the 12 labours themselves have found a strange new life in an entirely different context altogether, borrowed, loosely and often only half-consciously by modern writers on grief and recovery and personal transformation, who reach for this same image, a person forced to complete one impossible task after another, as the price of finally setting down an old, unbearable weight, whenever they want a way of describing what it actually feels like to work, patiently and without any guarantee of relief, through a grief or a guilt that was never really deserved in the first place. A modern echo, however unconscious, of exactly the question this whole ancient story was built to ask. It is worth noting, too, one final and rather fitting trace this whole story left behind, high above every single one of the labours and losses we have followed tonight, because the ancient Greeks placed Heracles himself among the stars, constellation still visible tonight if the sky above you happens to be clear, kneeling on one knee in the northern sky between the constellations of the Dragon and the Lyre, a placement later stargazers connected variously to his triumph over Ladon, the dragon who once guarded the golden apples, or to the death of Linus, whose own broken lyre still burns nearby in the same quarter of the sky, so that a hero who spent his entire mortal life labouring under the weight of a grief he never chose was given, in the end, a permanent, silent home directly overhead, visible to anyone willing to look up on a dark enough night, still kneeling, after all these centuries, exactly where the old astronomers first placed him. What this whole long story was really asking. We are nearly at the end of tonight's telling, and it is worth pausing before we let this story finally close to set Heracles beside the other great figures we have spent long nights with in this room. Because the comparison tells us something true about what this particular story was actually built to explore, that none of those other tales quite manage in the same way. Achilles, in the story of the war at Troy we told across an entire night in this room, chased a glory that burned brighter for being brief, a hero who understood and accepted that a short life spent in dazzling battlefield triumph outweighed a long one spent in obscurity, and who paid for that choice with an early death he had known was coming from the very moment he sailed for Troy. Odysseus, in the long wandering we spent another whole night following, survived not through overwhelming strength at all, but through patience and cunning and a stubborn, hard-won capacity to hold a distant future in his mind vividly enough to outlast every present temptation the sea threw in his path. Aeneas, in the story of Troy's fall and the founding of Rome, we told most recently in this room, carried a duty that was never truly his own to choose, setting aside his own private wants again and again in favour of an unborn nation's future he would never live to see completed. Heracles belongs beside all three of these men, and yet he is different from every one of them in a way worth naming, plainly before we close. He did not choose glory the way Achilles did, weighing a short, brilliant life against a long-forgotten one, and picking deliberately between them. He did not choose endurance the way Odysseus did, holding a known and beloved home firmly in mind across every distraction the world offered him. And he did not choose duty the way Aeneas did, accepting a fate laid on him by prophecy and dream that he might, in some other version of his own character, have simply refused. Heracles' entire life, from the moment two serpents entered his cradle to the moment he lay down on his own funeral pyre and asked a frightened stranger to light it, was built around a single, harder, less glamorous task than any of those other heroes ever faced. The task of atoning patiently and completely, and without any hope of ever fully repaying the debt, for a catastrophe that was never truly his fault to begin with, inflicted on him by a goddess who had marked him for suffering before he ever drew his first breath, and answered, in the end, not by some clever trick or some noble refusal, but simply by the relentless, exhausting, decade-spanning willingness to keep doing the next impossible thing, and the thing after that, because the alternative, living with an unanswered grief too large to carry any other way, was worse than any lion or hydra or three-bodied giant the world could set in front of him. It is worth noticing too one final asymmetry that this whole story leaves us with, because it is the detail that makes Heracles' own particular grief so much harder to resolve than any of the other losses this tradition asks us to sit with. When Achilles grieves for Patroclus, or when Aeneas grieves for Dido or for his own father, or for a wife lost in the smoke of a burning city, the grief belongs entirely to the man doing the grieving, a private wound inflicted by fate or by circumstance that he alone must carry. Heracles' grief is different and worse because the wound and the hand that dealt it were, for one unbearable stretch of one single night, exactly the same thing, and no later reconciliation with Hera, no eventual welcome onto Olympus, no marriage to the goddess of eternal youth, could ever actually undo the plain, physical fact that his own two hands, guided though they were by a force entirely outside his own will, had done what they did. This channel does not know of any comfort in the whole of Greek mythology large enough to answer that particular kind of grief honestly, and it does not think the story itself ever pretended to offer one. choosing instead to show us, across every single labour that followed, what a person actually does with a grief that has no comfort adequate to it. Not resolve it, because it cannot be resolved, but simply keep walking toward the next impossible task, and the one after that, because the walking itself, however exhausting, is the only form of answer that a wound of this particular size will ever actually permit. That perhaps is the truest reason this particular story has outlasted every softened, brightly coloured retelling that later ages layered on top of it, because underneath the monsters and the golden apples and the borrowed lion skin, it is a story about a very old and very human question that has nothing to do with strength at all. What do you actually owe, and to whom, when the worst thing you have ever done was never really a choice you made? And what does a life spent trying to answer that question honestly actually look like? Labour after labour, loss after loss, until the very last mountain and the very last fire finally arrives. Hercules never got to set that question down until the moment the flames themselves burned away everything mortal that had been carrying it. And it is worth sitting for a moment in that particular kind of exhaustion before we let ourselves finally rest tonight, because it is, in the end, a far more universal inheritance than any lion's skin or any borrowed set of pillars at the edge of the sea. It is worth carrying one last thought with you before we let this long night finally close, because it is the thought this channel keeps returning to whenever it tells a story built around suffering that was never actually earned. We have spent tonight with a man who strangled serpents before he could walk, who wrestled lions and hydras and giants and death itself, who carried the entire weight of the sky on his own shoulders rather than complain of the burden, and who found, again and again, that none of that overwhelming strength could actually protect him from the one thing that mattered most, a grief inflicted on him by a goddess's jealousy that no labour, however impossible, could ever fully answer. And yet he kept going anyway, not because any oracle promised him the pain would stop, but because the alternative, setting the labours down and living, unatoned, inside a grief that size, was a worse fate than any lion or any hydra the world could still put in front of him. There is something in that particular kind of endurance worth carrying into your own sleep tonight, whatever weight you yourself happen to be setting down at the end of this day, because the strongest man the ancient world ever imagined was never strong because nothing could hurt him. He was strong because everything did, and he kept walking anyway. There is no more labour left to complete tonight, and no more mountain left to climb. The fire has burned down to embers, the pyre has gone quiet, and a whole life's worth of grief has, at long last, been carried all the way to its own rest. If you are still awake, you do not have to be. If tonight's long story carried you somewhere good, you are welcome to like the video and subscribe, and if you would like to, leave a thought down in the comments, and I will read it in the morning, but that is tomorrow's business, and it can wait. For now, let your body settle a little more heavily into the bed beneath you. Let your shoulders finally set down a weight they have been carrying all day without your even noticing. Let your breathing slow, all on its own, the way it wants to, and let the sound of a distant fire on a mountainside fade out gently behind you, the way it faded at last for one exhausted, grieving, endlessly burdened man who had finally, after everything, earned the right to rest. Close your eyes and let yours come now too. Good night and sweet dreams.